everyone. Thanks for being here. You'll notice that we have some refreshments and snacks. Thank you, staff, for providing that. Should we do an introduction at the end? No. Okay. We have a lot to discuss tonight and a few things to act on early on, but I was going to ask staff if they can start by giving an overview of the agenda.
Thank you, Co-Chair. So the first up is we have a follow-up to the Urban Village presentation to all the comments and question, more of clarification. Jennifer Pioze with supervising planner for the Urban Village team will go over that. Next, we'll be going over the actual voting, public comment, and then voting on the recommendation of the Urban Villages. Following that, we have a presentation by Opticos Design, Dan Perolek. Going over that, and then follow that by Plex Housing, a developer perspective, an actual building in San Jose on that. And after that, we'll have a discussion on missing middle housing and Plex Housing, and then we'll go on to the next topic of residential uses in neighborhood business districts, followed by a task force discussion and public comment. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Jennifer to do the follow-up.
Great, thank you. So we set this up with kind of a questions and answers. Many of these were contained in the memo, so you can follow along. So the first piece is about horizons. So there were a lot of questions around horizons. So why do we have them and how do they work? Do we need them? And can we eliminate and or accelerate horizons for more flexibility and to encourage more housing development? So the purpose of horizons, and we have a sheet, Appendix 2, it's basically to phase housing. And so we focused in Horizon 1, all of the villages were near transit and other established infrastructure. And then 2 and 3 were villages that were away from those areas that didn't have the current transit or other infrastructure investments we felt were needed to be able to have good housing development. It also was a tool for planning to understand where they should plan next. And so generally speaking, we radiated out of downtown along our main rail lines and away from downtown, then getting to our light rail and then into the suburbs. Okay. So this doesn't show up very well in color here, unfortunately, but we have different paths under horizons. The same chart is on page 4 of your packet. And so we have current horizon and then future horizon. So our current horizon is Horizon 1, so that is our left-hand side, and future horizons 2 and 3 on the right, and then broken down by type of project. So we have 3 different types of projects we see before us that may or may not be affected by horizons. First is market rate residential or mixed use residential projects, both market rate. So they can proceed if you have an approved urban village plan and you're in Horizon 1. You can also proceed if you're in with an approved urban village plan in Horizon 2 or 3. So it's the same. If you don't have an approved urban village plan and your market rate, you cannot proceed regardless of horizon. This is for market rate. Moving on to signature projects. So signature projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is our policy of exceptions. And so in the event that there's an exceptional project and it meets the criteria set forth by the council, they can move forward in urban villages regardless of horizon if there's no approved urban village plan. And our third option is 100% deed restricted affordable housing. They can move forward no matter what, just yeses across the board. We have policies that allow them to move forward in approved urban villages and not approved urban villages regardless of horizon. So if horizons were eliminated, what would happen? So Appendix 3, basically the path of housing doesn't change. So the previous chart is the same. You still need an urban village plan to build market rate housing, unless you're gonna meet one of the 3 exceptions. Signature projects. These are not intended to be commonplace. We like to call it exception because it is an exception. Sites that have a general plan designation that is residential, so something that's urban residential, transit residential, housing can move forward. Or something that is 100% affordable, and we have policies around that. If you didn't have horizons, you wouldn't have to open a new growth horizon once you finish the current growth horizon, so that's a bonus. Also, the residential pool policy would not be applicable. And I think, did you talk about it last time, the pool policy? So the pool policy, refresher, 5,000 units of both either all signature projects or Horizon 2 or 3 market rate projects can move forward ahead of the growth horizon opening. It basically places a metering on the amount of residential that can move forward before something is opened, or before the horizons are opened, or before an urban village plan is adopted. And so it's a way for us to not have residential approved before we get our comprehensive planning efforts in place or open up our horizons.
And if you recall, staff is recommending eliminating the residential pool policy.
Yes. Okay. So solutions moving forward. We have different ideas about how we're going, with different state laws that may or may not have been covered last time. We are actually moving forward with creating mixed-use and multifamily zoning districts. We don't actually have these in place right now in our code. And these will actually help streamline housing permitting. Also, as part of this, we are going to have objective requirements for housing, so it's easier for housing projects to move forward. It's not as nebulous. Also, our urban village plans will be shortened, and the timelines for completion and consistency between them will be increased, because we're going to be relying upon our upcoming, soon-to-be adopted citywide design guidelines, which I think are coming forward in the summer, June. Whether or not that summer is debatable. And then, I guess it's spring.
It's spring till the 21st.
Great, spring. And then our complete streets design standards and guidelines, which are already adopted by our partners in DOT, Department of Transportation. And so what we're relying upon moving forward, those of you who are familiar with our urban village plans, they're very large documents. And there's a lot of repetition between them as far as what is good design? What do we want our streetscapes to look like? And so we feel that we can rely upon some of these outside pieces of work, because good design is good design across the board regardless, and actually have our urban village plans focus on the area-specific things that the communities want. So for example, certain communities may like Mediterranean or Spanish-style architecture. It's very important for the heritage of the area. We can have those sorts of specific standards that are not citywide. We don't want to have those in our citywide design guidelines, but they may be applicable to a specific village place. Signature projects. Few questions about that. So why do signature project policy changes have prescriptive requirements? And then why do projects have to provide more than their fair share of commercial? So, as stated previously, signature projects were intended when adopted with our original general plan to be exceptional projects, amazing, unique projects that serve as catalysts for the entire village. And generally speaking, not across the board, but sometimes when signature projects have come in, it's a indicator to staff that this is a place we might want to plan next because the market is there. They provide above and beyond jobs and housing. This is something that the council wanted to see and something that staff upholds. They also have more community engagement than our standard projects, because these are areas where there aren't adopted plans, if you remember the flow chart or the table previously. And so the community hasn't had their opportunity to do their comprehensive planning effort, so they want to be involved in what this catalyst project will look like. They have to have high quality design, public open space of some sort, and they have to be in a prominent location. So all that being said, these standards are very subjective. And so, why are we updating our signature project policy? Because we've heard time and again, people want clear requirements and expectations, both for the development community and for the public. How can I measure this? How do I know someone's complying? Also, there are state law changes that have come through, either in effect now or going to be in effect in 2020, starting in January. For housing projects that meet the definition of housing, you have to have measurable, objective standards that you can hold housing to, nothing else. And so the policy is not objective. We have to make it objective to be able to enforce it. We cannot exercise personal judgment, either as planning staff or as decision makers, to approve or deny a housing project. If we say, well, I just don't like it, that is not a reason under state law to disprove that housing project. So that's why we're doing this. More than fair share of commercial. The council wanted exceptional projects to move forward. We have two ahead of the adoption of the urban village plan, and we have two general plan policies, implementation policies, 2.9 and 210, that talk about this and wanting to have this above and beyond commercial requirement for more jobs to come into the area to be a catalyst. More jobs, more people, more housing, more people. Yeah, so once again, go ahead if you want to.
Yeah. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that urban villages were really planned to be growth areas for not just housing, but employment, commercial, job space as well. So that's really sort of the parameter, was if you're building really a higher density above sort of and beyond the residential and the commercial, the employment, that space, that was really is the overall vision and goal of the urban village plan. So if you're kind of providing both of those things, that was really one of the criteria that the council decided was really significant to meet as a signature project.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm not going to get into depth on this table. This was discussed at the last meeting, but this is the proposal for the signature project policy moving forward. It's a little more complicated because it has to be measurable. And so we're breaking it down by village type. We have 4 village types. Neighborhood villages, they're typically located around suburbs. Local transit villages, as it sounds, they are on our transit lines, think light rail or bus rapid transit. Commercial corridor and center villages, these are large commercial corridors like South Bascom. And our regional transit villages, think Berryessa BART. And so not to get into all the details, but this outlines locational requirements, making it very clear, yes or no, does this meet the locational requirement? We currently have a locational requirement, but it's extremely subjective. It says prominent. What does that mean? So we want to be more specific. Above fair share for commercial, we have come up with these percentages, and this is what we think is fair. Exploring the idea of having additional commercial requirements if a project site is very large. The larger you are, the more you can accommodate. Residential densities, putting out there, if you're in a neighborhood, maybe it's smaller densities is what can be accommodated given their suburban context versus local transit or commercial corridor, maybe around the 55. And then regional, if you're thinking high capacity transit, higher densities. And then open space requirements, like I said, that was needed. It just said you need to provide something that's publicly accessible, but in what shape, what form, what size was unclear. And then how many public meetings is sufficient? So we want to provide some sort of parameter. I don't think there's anything else I want to say, but just in summary, we want to make it objective, like a checklist. So we have had many signature projects come through, and by many, I think it's 8. We have come through, whether they've just been filed or approved. And the criteria have been applied inconsistently. And so as a way moving forward to reset, this is what we're doing, is what the previous table showed. We have 3 approved signature projects that would be approved under the, how am I gonna say this? So 3 of them would meet the criteria that we've outlined. 3 of them would only need to provide an additional 1,800 square feet of commercial to meet those commercial criteria. And the commercial seems to be the sticking point for many projects. Being able to provide the commercial. It's not usually the open space or the residential density. They want to build the housing. It's specifically the jobs numbers. And so looking at the ones that have been approved, they're all pretty close to these requirements, and so we don't feel that they're too out of line with what we've seen. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you. Jessica, did you want to make a comment? Or-
It's Q-Line, and
I'm sorry,
we're just showing the summary of recommendations of what staff recommendation from the past, last time. If you want to start the public comment and.
Yes, we do. Any comments on this item? I know we had public comment at the end of last meeting, but are there any public comments on this item? Yes, please, come up and state your name, if you would.
My name is Alex Shore with Catalyze SV. Is time limit of 2 minutes, I trust? Time limit of 2 minutes?
I apologize, yes.
Great. So I just wanted to address staff and the task force. I think you may have seen a letter in your packet from Catalyze SV. We are involved as an organization in improving the community engagement process to get more housing and better development built. And so we had our committee, our community engagement committee of our members take a look at the signature project policy, especially related to community engagement, and offered some ideas for city staff and for all of you on improving that community engagement policy. It does make sense to have a specific objective requirement. Jennifer talked about 2 meetings in particular. I think our point would be that it is not about the quantity of the meetings, but the quality of the meetings. And how can you create a community engagement process that truly hears the community's ideas and incorporates those ideas into how the developer builds that project. And in our letter, we offered some initial ideas for how this policy could be actually changed from the very proposal you see before you today. And so we would ask you to take a look at that. We would also ask you to take a look at the framing of the policy. It talks a lot about the policy focused on listening to the, quote, area residents and listening to their perspective on character and identity. And for those of us who are invested in building more housing in our community, we know that those are frequently terms that are used to refer only to the viewpoints of those who already live in our community, not those that we want to bring into our communities. So we would encourage staff to look at a framing that's slightly different, that talks about how we can create a community engagement policy that is a win for our developers, our existing residents, our broader community, and our city. And so we would ask the General Plan Task Force to consider recommendations to the city staff around this signature project policy, specifically related to community engagement. And we stand ready to work with anyone, including all of you, on ideas for that policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to comment on the general plan, because our neighborhood, the Garden Alameda, has been injured by the general plan, and we felt that we had not been notified that there was a general plan change, that the west side of Stockton, when we bought our property, was a conforming rezoning to be residential. Then about, I guess, 5 or 6 years later, it changed to commercial. And that the whole plan in 2008 or 10, whenever it was, to bring commerciality to our community, into our historic neighborhood, we never got alerted. We never got the big card that said, not in government ease, but say, how would you feel having a 5-story hotel next to your residential home? That never came. That should have come. And we are actually taking it up with the grand jury because of the injury to our community. And I really appreciated what you were saying in a lot of your documentation here about village. Village is a very important term, and we've even created a neighborhood association called the Garden Alameda Village Association, because by putting commercial into our neighborhoods has really injured our neighborhood, injured our, destabilized our communities when you do that and bring bars and hotels into neighborhoods, with the operant word being transients. We don't need transients in our community, yet that is what our city is bringing to make money. And that has got to stop. In a climate emergency, we've got to start looking at building resilient communities where neighbors know each other and neighbors work together. And those are the jobs of the future that we need to bring to San Jose, are fossil fuel-free jobs, not jobs based on fossil fuel like a hotel and the airport connection. So basically, really notifying us of the general plan changes to our community is what we're asking, because we never got notified of the general plan changes.
Thank you.
Hi, could I see the previous chart, please? Yeah, that one there. Open space requirement, just 2,000 square foot. Is it for a small project? That's almost nothing. That's less than a city lot. Is that right? I mean, going through my calculations, you have what, 5 acres and 30 units per acre. That's 150 units. 300 people. You should have about an acre of land. That seems awfully small. So, is that in addition to it, or is that just that number?
Sure, happy to respond. So This is in addition or different from the PIO, PDO parks requirements.
Ah, okay, so
So
this is
this
on
is-
top of that then?
Right, so
Okay,
they'll still
that's-
have their parks fees, and they will still be providing private open space like balconies or patios for the residential units. They will still be providing common open space like pools and rec rooms. These
Okay.
are publicly accessible open spaces in addition to that on the property.
Good, thank you.
Any further comments? Okay, let's open it up for the task force. If you have any questions on anything, I think what we're going to do is separate the recommendations, thank you, staff, for putting these back up, into 5 separate votes. We'll start with the boundaries discussion. We had quite a bit of conversation about that. And just to clarify, we are removing the Reed and Graham site from the Race Light Rail Urban Village boundary. As you saw in your packet, there is a reason for deferring that particular component of that site. But are there any discussion, any burning questions? I see one placard up, but boy, Harvey, I believe that's you. And then Jesse.
And Eric is up
Okay.
as well.
And Jim? Yes, please.
So I don't quite understand. I tried to read through this and unfortunately had some computer problems with my internet. Thank you, AT&T. Anyway, the question I have is, did staff make any changes to the recommendation that we will be voting on?
No.
Okay, so I would oppose that. I think that we really do need to keep the Reed and Graham site within the boundaries of the urban village, because I think in the future, we need to find another more suitable site for that, since it is highly toxic, has created many, many health issues, including potentially having given me emphysema, never having smoked, since I'm downwind from it. I think that putting all the thousands of units of housing that we're putting in that area, a 8-acre park that we've created there, soccer fields, kids running around, breathing in all those fumes was
Harvey,
decent. Okay, I'm
we
done.
did have quite a big of conversation about this last time, and we know it's a really important and large conversation, which is why we want to defer this particular piece of it.
Oh, we're going to defer this?
Yes.
I'm
This-
sorry, I
this-
didn't hear,
yeah.
didn't hear it.
Sorry about, just this particular element, is that?
I
I'm saying
agree.
no.
Yes, I agree with that.
What does that mean, Michael?
I mean, just to be clear, staff is not proposing to defer it. If the co-chairs want to.
Yes, I'm sorry. The staff
Okay.
is, well, you recommended removing it from the
Well,
boundary.
I mean, I
is that
think we're
right?
comfortable with the vote going the way the vote goes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll take this, this recommendation from staff to remove it, but my recommendation was to defer this conversation because it really is going to be quite a lengthy conversation in and of itself. Councilmember, did you want to make a comment about this?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Teresa, that we should defer this item from the vote.
Thank you. Any other questions regarding this item? Yes.
Can we make a motion to adopt staff recommendation with the removing Reed and Graham?
Great. Do we have a second?
Second.
I heard one here first. Okay, why don't we go ahead and take a vote? Or, okay, discussion on the motion. Any other discussion on the motion? Any other comments? I still see placards up. Jim Zito? Yes?
So I just want to be clear on what our goal is overall. In the very first general plan task force, when we created 2040, we were really concerned about jobs, housing, and balance. In the second one, we kind of backed away from that a little bit. And I'm wondering now today, in this round, are we still very concerned about jobs, housing, and balance? Or is it not as critical from the staff's perspective?
Yeah, so from the staff's perspective, we still have the goals of the general plan that were modified the last 4-year go-around, and we are still concerned about the jobs and housing imbalance in the city for a number of reasons having to do with greenhouse gas emissions, vehicle miles traveled, quality of life issues of people being stuck in traffic, health issues with diabetes, emphysema, all kinds of diseases because you're sitting in your car in traffic. And there's also the fiscal element, which really played out, was a big part of the general plan discussion 8 years ago, because that was a general plan developed in the recession, the Great Recession. But there are these other things that I think are really, really as important as well. So that is an issue. We still have the goal to achieve a ratio of 1.1 jobs to employed, San Jose employed residents, going from the bedroom of Silicon Valley to being slightly more of a job center. Not as much as our surrounding cities, but more of a job center than we are today.
We're going to finalize any comments on this side, and I don't see any, so let's go to this side. Eric, we'll start with you and work forward. Oh, was there, I'm sorry, Councilmember Arenas.
Thank you. I just want to speak on item number 1, which is eliminating the Evergreen Village. And so I wanted to ask staff just to go over, and the reason I'm asking this is because I've had a lot of concerned residents where we have an Evergreen Village Square, and it's an urban village type of a setting, and we have a couple of lots that are just empty, and there's just a big dirt, mound of dirt. And so I want to make sure that by eliminating this Evergreen Village, which I already know and I'm assured, I just want to make sure that the staff has publicly asserts this, that we will still have some capacity to develop those empty lots over at Evergreen Village Square.
Yeah, so there is capacity. There is capacity in the ADP, but we'll hold that conversation for next time. That's a large issue. But there is capacity. So if someone wants to develop on the sites that remain in the Evergreen Urban Village, that I know I believe there's a site that actually has a zoning on it, they can go forward. I know there's an interest to develop on a site that's not designated for housing, but they could apply for a general plan amendment on that site. It's really for a very limited number of housing. So eliminating the village doesn't preclude housing moving forward in those cases where there aren't already entitlements that can move forward now. It actually could potentially facilitate it more so, because the idea is that we'd have to do a village plan for maybe one small project to allow it to go forward, or they'd have to do a signature project. And that village really, in our mind, is pretty much built out, as is the whole Evergreen specific plan area.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll head over to this side. Eric,
I do have a question on the staff's presentation, clarification.
please.
But not related to the subject, so I don't know if you want to
Okay,
go back
that's
to that
fine.
later.
That's fine.
Okay, but before that, I wanted to ask a question of my esteemed colleague from District 6, Mr. Milligan. I've been watching too many impeachment hearings, so I'd like to have this formality. Your distinguished friend from Willow Glen, your motion, because I think I'm confused. Your motion, I believe, is to not agree with the staff recommendation to remove Reed and Graham from the urban village. Is that correct?
My motion is to accept eliminating the Evergreen Village and the East Capitol Foxdale Drive, but not take out Reed and Graham from the Ray Street Light Rail
Okay.
Urban Village.
So to keep Reed and Graham within the
That's correct.
Ray Street Urban Village. Great. Good on that clarification. My question clarifying staff's presentation was, Jennifer, you have a sentence here about council wanted only exceptional projects to move ahead of urban village plan adoption, and you cite IP 2.9 and 2.10. I'm reading the general plan. I don't see in 2.9 or 2.10 anything about exceptional projects or anything. So can we cite the language you're referring to before we get to the signature project discussion? Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry. We're still trying to figure out the motion on the floor. Thank you so much. Yes, was there a comment over here? Yes, Juan.
So I'd like to request that the task force add a couple of urban village designations. And so I didn't know if this is the point at which I would do that. Is this the point at which I would do that?
I think you should bring up the comment, please.
Okay.
Yes.
So, given that one urban village, and I'm looking at my notes, urban village designation, the Foxdale Apartments area is being removed for good reason. Totally agree with that. That light rail will be extended to East Ridge Mall, down Capitol Expressway, across Story Road, that's in East San Jose. That adding urban village designations in East San Jose would increase housing and employment, thereby increasing opportunity in an area that is sometimes overlooked. Even one of the letter writers for this meeting referenced 3 areas, South, North, and West San Jose, and made no reference to East San Jose, and so it's possible they didn't consider that. And that in a span of just 1 day since yesterday, the task force has received, and it's all in your packet, over 50 requests from residents requesting that the task force designate 2 areas in East San Jose as urban villages. The first area is at Story Road and Capitol Expressway. The second is at Story Road and White Road. Again, those are both in East San Jose. Then I request that the task force designate those 2 areas in East San Jose as urban villages, or take the steps necessary to begin the designation process. I understand that that would be very complicated probably, but that is something I am requesting as part of redistribution of planned growth and urban village boundary modifications.
Thank you. I will refer that to staff, given this is a new conversation. If you have some quick comments.
Yeah, no, so I think we thought that was going to come up in the NBD neighborhood business discussion, but yeah, I mean, we're amenable to adding that if that's the task force wish, and there's a lot of input from the community, to add the Story Road as a neighborhood business district. Our suggestion would be that there is a boundary of that growth area already, which is an employment growth area, and includes, my understanding, both of the 2 areas you're talking about at Capitol and White, and just make it that larger boundary if you were amenable to that.
I absolutely am, and that should streamline the designation if the task force chooses to provide additional opportunity to East San Jose.
Can we make that a friendly amendment to the motion, and then I'll second?
Is the motioner, Sean, are you comfortable with amending? To add.
I'm just wondering if that's more of a conversation for the neighborhood business districts and not for the urban village boundaries.
Okay, let's defer it for a moment and take it up as a
Sure.
separate item, if we might.
Yeah, and it seems best as a separate motion anyway.
Okay. So let's continue discussion on the first item. Were there any, yes, Juan, yours is down. Come and go.
I apologize for coming back to the Reading Graham site, but I'm confused about the conflicting reports about what they want to do with their own business. Staff is saying that they want to, the business is thriving, in their words, and then I'm hearing reports that they are looking to change. What is the current status? I mean, because I think a lot of the decision-making should be on what the landowner intends to do with their property.
I think staff should probably clarify.
Sure, so Office of Economic Development reached out to the owner of the business and the property owner and the general manager. And what they said is that a number of years ago, I'm not sure how long ago, but at some point in the past, they actually did look at relocating because of the housing that was going on in the park. And they were not successfully able to find a site in the South Bay to relocate to, so that they decided instead to reinvest, stay where they are, and they're committed to staying in their current site. You know, something could change, but that's their position at this point.
Thank you.
Councilmember Foley?
Thank you. So I'm a little confused. I appreciate the 3 items that we're voting on, but I'm wondering when we will be having the conversation about whether urban villages are necessary and whether they are an impediment to development. Are we going to have that conversation at some point?
So, I think I've got an answer.
Because I think
for
that's
the-
a bigger picture question.
So we're bound here by the council memos that were approved by the council on this, and that wasn't, the whole issue of urban villages itself was not part of the council discussion. We were asked to look at the boundaries of the urban villages. There was one memo that was authored by the mayor and signed, I believe, by like 4 other council members. But just the issue of urban villages at all was not part of the scope. And in our first packet, and it's online, there is the summary that staff prepared of all the recommendations that were approved by the council on that. So I don't know, Michael, if you have anything about that, but I didn't see that on the list.
No, it's not. I mean, the urban village strategy is one of the 12 major strategies of the general plan. It's in the council's direction. By not including it, in terms of, the direction is to tweak it as we're doing, talking about tonight, but not eliminate it. It was really, I think, so it's really seen as a way to accommodate future both jobs and housing growth in San Jose on transit.
Okay, so let's, we do have a motion on the floor, Ms. Milligan. As I understand the motion, it would be remove the Evergreen Village from Urban Village with the clarification from staff, remove capital Foxdale, make no change to the Race Street boundary for Reed and Graham. Is that a correct statement?
That's correct.
And it's been seconded. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? One. Okay. And I recall your comments at the last meeting, and that's Ms. Yasny. All right, there's the separate issue that Juan Estrada has brought up in regard to 2 new urban villages, or it may be folded into the NBD discussion that we're going to have in the future. We have to still conform to the Brown Act. That wasn't part of the areas that we had discussed at the last meeting. It's not part of the staff recommendations. That's not to suggest we shouldn't pursue what you're talking about. And I think maybe the appropriate next step would be simply to refer that to staff, and we can bring that, your proposal, Mr. Estrada, back at a future meeting. Are you agreeable to that?
I think I am. I just want a better understanding of the Brown Act implications, given that, is it because it is not one of the 3 staff recommendations as part of one, or
Right.
not detailed in number 4? No, which one is the neighborhood business district?
Well,
Oh, the one that we haven't covered. Is it because it's not specifically named in there?
you know, we could have a further legal discussion. I think we might be fortunate and not have any attorneys here tonight. Yeah. But I think it would just be a matter of normal practice to give staff the opportunity to respond to a new proposal that we hadn't discussed at the last meeting, and it wasn't really subject of public comment. I recognize there were the letters that you've mentioned that have come in, but as a normal course of practice, we would refer it to staff so they can write a report and we can bring it back for a vote.
So it would come back to the next meeting. We would respond to your proposal, come back to the next meeting, and it would be voted on the next meeting, likely.
You comfortable with that one?
Okay, and then do I need to make any type of motion, or it's just a given now?
We'll come back and there'll be an
Thank you, I
opportunity to
appreciate
make a
it.
motion at the next meeting.
All
Thank
right,
you so
thank
much.
you.
Why don't we move on to the next policy item, which is, actually, let's jump to 3 for a moment. Let's get some, momentum going here. Do we have any questions or comments or a motion? We would welcome a motion on item 3, the residential pool policy. Jim?
Second.
I'm sorry, Pat? You move.
recommendation.
Okay, and Councilmember Foley. Any comments?
I have a question.
Yes, please, Harvey.
So I'm not quite sure what removing the residential pool units policy would do.
It adds flexibility, as I understand. The staff just commented on this. It really just frees up the conversation. It's not metering of housing production in the way that it was originally
So
crafted.
we're not adding any new housing units to that number, or?
No, we're not, we're actually not adding housing units to that number. We actually don't see the policy as needed.
Great.
And so we just think given it's not needed, and in a worst case, it could actually provide a barrier. We were proposing to eliminate it. I think the idea was that it's really for urban villages that have an approved plan that are in Horizon 3 or 2, not one of the current growth horizons, but actually, in effect, what happens when we approve an urban village plan, We're generally doing it because there's a market for development in that area, not always, but usually. And then there's a lot of interest in like, well, we just got this plan done, let's move forward and move it in Horizon 1. So we actually really haven't had a case where we need to use the pool in that circumstance. We do use the pool for the signature project, but this is getting very technical, but in some, we don't see the need for this policy.
Great,
It
thank you.
doesn't do much of anything.
Yes, Sean?
This is a question for staff. So if there was a substitute motion on the floor to eliminate the urban village horizons, and if you eliminated the residential pool policy, and you didn't have an adopted urban village plan, couldn't you run into a problem?
No, I didn't quite catch the whole question.
So let me explain further. So you have 62 urban villages? You got 12 adopted urban village plans. So let's say that the task force voted to eliminate the horizons. You still have unapproved urban villages, correct?
Correct.
So if you eliminated the pool policy and you had unapproved plans, how would projects proceed?
The same way they do today.
Signature.
You need a signature project, 100% affordable, or an adopted urban village plan. It doesn't
Okay.
affect it.
Okay.
Any other question? Eric, I see your placard up. Is that for comment? No. Anyone else? Yes, please, Councilmember.
I have a clarifying question to that answer, because there were 3 exceptions, and one is a site with the residential general plan designation. Without the pool, does that get eliminated as an option?
No,
So they can just go forward and it doesn't matter if there's a pool or not?
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, actually, I think that was much clearer and easier to kind of digest. All in favor of the motion on the floor to approve staff's recommendation? Any opposed? Great, 2 down. Wonderful. Let's go to item 5.5, which is item 4 up here, the implementation general plan policy. Let's see. Any questions about the policy for staff? Yeah, that would be helpful. Do you want to make comment? Okay.
That's on signature projects.
Okay, so this language was from our packet from the last meeting. And basically, we're going to keep, the proposal from the staff is to keep the same general language about the urban village planning process, but eliminate the 3 factors that were under there before that were emphasizing concerns about conversion of employment lands. I think based on the presentation from staff at the last meeting, as well as comments from task force members, there seems to be a general consensus that we want to encourage residential development as much as we can in urban villages, and that these policies that speak of it not being a process for conversion of employment lands are not consistent with the direction that and the needs that are currently in the city. So the proposal would be to eliminate what's really not essentially any kind of restriction, but just policy statements about conversion of employment land. So is there a motion in favor of the staff recommendation?
So moved.
Okay. Any discussion on that? Bonnie, is your hand up? Yeah. Okay.
While I approve of this, the point is that we've always liked to have a public statement about conversion of employment lands and not, right? So if you're going to remove this, which I'm amenable to, is there going to be some other mechanism to make a public assertion that we care deeply about not converting employment lands to non-employment uses?
Yeah, I mean, the general plan has a number of policies in regards to that, preserving employment land, particularly industrial land, but employment land in general. I should note that this language that you see here that's crossed off, this was not in the original policy that the task force approved or the council approved in 2011. This was added by the council, I think, in 2016. So what we're proposing is taking it back to the original language. But we have a lot of policies regarding preserving and enhancing commercial and other employment lands.
So, you know, it's important to remember some of how this all started, and some of this predated some of the newer council members, that back in Envision 2040, we were looking at strategies for new housing. And we were looking at strategies of implementing that within the existing boundaries of the city to avoid sprawl, loss of open space. And the obvious areas that we were looking at were lots of older retail developments in the city or underutilized commercial properties, which were perhaps not best suited for retail development in the future, but provided opportunities for housing within the existing city boundaries and near transit. And so that's why this language, when it got added on in the years after it, was somewhat inconsistent with what we as a task, at least the original Envision 2040 task force had been doing, which was exactly this, looking at land that wasn't presently planned for higher density housing, but looking at converting it. And so, Bonnie, to your question, the policies of avoiding conversion are still there because the urban villages that were identified by staff were not just a race to identify any and all industrial land in the city, but specific areas that met those criteria that we talked about of underutilized retail, non-residential properties that were close to transit and suitable for housing. So I think this is actually consistent, as Michael was saying, with the original direction. Maybe you weren't saying that directly, Michael, but consistent with the original direction of the Envision 2040 task force. Harvey?
And just want to, consistent with what you're saying, I want to make sure that there are no unintended consequences of it. Because as we created the urban villages, we were taking often commercial land and putting housing into the same footprint and mixing it up so that we would decrease VMT and do sorts of things that would be helpful for the environment, health, et cetera, et cetera. I want to make sure that we don't lose that within each of the urban villages, that we don't somehow all of a sudden build all housing where we wanted to have a mixed use.
Yeah, I mean, the plans are very clear that we have to plan for both the jobs and the housing capacity. It's about accommodating both and coming up with a fine-grained plan of how you're going to do that. We've actually ran into the problems with these policies when we were doing West San Carlos, as an example. We felt there were properties in West San Carlos that either should go all residential or we didn't care about the use. It was about the form. And in that form, you could do whatever you wanted. You could do mixed use, you could do commercial, you could do residential. But given this policy, we had to sort of start applying commercial obligations to all the properties, as opposed to saying, these are the areas that are should be more commercial focused, these areas could go all residential, these areas should be mixed use or could be mixed use. So that's where we started running into problems when we were actually doing the urban village plans with the changes that were made in about 2016.
Thank you, staff. Okay, we have a motion on the floor and a second. Can we take a vote, please? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, great, thank you. All right, let's move on to signature project. And that was item 5 on the staff's recommendations. Adopt an objective standard requirements for signature projects. Any quick questions, clarifications? Yes, Leslie.
I just had a really quick question. Since it says that basically the task force is not getting involved in some of the specifics, when is this coming forward to council? Did you mention that?
It's coming forward to council at the end of next year, so probably in the fall or winter timeframe.
Councilmember Rennes, do you have a?
Thank you. I really appreciate having more objective standard requirements under the signature project, and I really appreciated, Alex, sure, you came in and you summarized a bit of what you wrote in your letter in terms of really having some concrete ways to measure engagement, and I really appreciate that. I wonder if we can include some of that evaluation for staff to bring back. I don't know that we can adopt it as is right now, but if staff could evaluate some of that and bring it back and include that as part of the motion.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely evaluate that. I think, and having read Alex's language, a lot of that is kind of more fine grain that you would put in the general plan.
Right.
It's almost more of a policy of practice of how you would do it. So, but we could explore like the spirit of it, of how it could be captured.
Thank you.
Okay, Jesse?
Oh,
Oh,
Oh, yeah, and the other thing I should say is that, Jennifer, do you want to do the honors, Jennifer?
Sure. So we had an audit on development noticing. Many of you may be aware of that. And so we have a council policy on outreach, and we believe that this would be the most appropriate place to have this sort of fine grain instruction to both planning staff and anyone else who's doing development in the city, to have this sort of fine grain information in 6-30. And that's something that is on our work plan as policy to get underway and look at that and see what we can do to improve it. I don't know where on the work plan it is. That's up to Michael to say, but eventually on the work plan.
Thank you. Jesse?
On top of taking a look at the outreach, I'd like the group to consider including equity analysis and mitigation for displacement measures as a part of the policy.
Where would equity and displacement, staff, if you can respond to that, where that makes the most sense to have that conversation? I know the council is having that conversation quite a bit, but.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to think, to
Okay.
think about that a little bit.
That's fine.
To what degree, yeah, we'll have to think about that.
Thank you. Vince?
One of the concerns I have, I do support objective standards, but reading the slides, it says the state law says that personal judgment cannot be used to approve or deny a housing project. I understand the deny side, and I think that was the objective of the state law. Is staff's position that you could also not approve a project based on personal judgment? And here's what I mean. If a project misses an objective standard by, say, it's half a foot off on how much frontage it should have of commercial space, like, you can't say, well, overall, it's pretty good, so my judgment is this is a good project.
Correct.
So the requirements are strict, and the state law is clear on that?
Yes.
For approval? Okay.
Okay, we have a few more. Jason, is that you or is that Harvey? Yes, Jason.
Thank you. I'm recalling the discussion that we had in the last convening about whether some of the requirements are too descriptive and whether it would impede development. I am a bit curious as to how that discussion last time went in one direction, and then the feedback that staff got to even create these recommendations were in another one. But also, if there was, and maybe this is more of a policy or a practice type level, but if there's a way to enhance the community engagement portion where it actually lends to creating these requirements per that area, if it's a signature project for that area, then kind of a universal kind of application throughout. And I think that's a number of things, having an equity lens, kind of thinking about how these signature projects are signature for the community that's there, than just an objective requirement of what signature projects is that may be different from whichever part of the city that you're in.
I want to make sure we're understanding what you're asking. So it sounds like it's almost you're doing a mini urban village planning effort to understand the community's perspective and needs and desires to craft a signature project policy that's specific to a specific area.
I don't think it has to go into that level, but I think the intentionality of that process is important, especially if you're labeling as a signature project, whatever that form looks like.
It should be reflective of the community's.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to say it's a
interest
signature
and-
project
Good-
and it's
good suggestion.
XYZ and it's supposed to be great, you
Right.
should at least get that buy-in from the
Yeah.
community,
Thank you.
however that's incorporated. But also, the first point, I'm curious as to the discussion staff had that led to the recommendations the first time around, and in many ways, it was different than the discussion that was here, because I recall last time we thought it was too prescriptive.
It has to be prescriptive per state law.
Yeah, I don't know if there was, I'm not sure there was a consensus about being too prescriptive. I think there was voices that thought it was too prescriptive.
Okay, we have several more comments, and we still have another item here, so we're going to go quickly. Is that yours, Bonnie, that's up? Yeah, that's Harvey's. Or Harvey's? Somebody? Yes, please.
So the question I have is, what are the metrics that would be included in these objective standard requirements? Would it include, as I recall, when we first set up some of these signature projects, we added things like world-class architecture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are those things to be eliminated, and then it will only be things that are measurable? And what things would be measurable?
Staff?
Hey, I think what I can indicate, Harvey, is that the standards that the staff is seeking to implement would be specific. They'd be specific, and they're in the staff report on page 6 and 7. Does everybody have that report? And maybe you could put the standards back up there again. These are the standards. They're minimums. They're minimum standards. And as I've understood it from the staff, they're standards that are fairly easily achievable. So we're not doing anything that's subjective anymore, like world-class standards. These are the standards that are here. They're all quantifiable. So, okay, does that deal? Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to, Bonnie, do you have your
Yeah,
placard up?
just real fast.
Yes.
So, to Jason's point too, so you can have things that are measurable and objective, but you can have things that are relatively inflexible. And there's a big difference between having something that's measurable and objective and having something that is so stringent that it makes it difficult for developers to do. And that's what they were talking about last time.
Exactly.
Is that this, so my question is, I get that it needs to be measurable, but is it too far in the direction of putting a lot of constraints on developers wherein we won't have the signature projects that we want? So that's my question.
I think we'll hear that from comments, perhaps. We're going to jump over to this side. I don't see any, those of you who have already made comments, if you could put yours down, I'd appreciate it. Eric?
First of all, I want to just draw people's attention to the memo that I submitted. It's in your packet, explaining why the signature project, job density, and the horizons are problematic and are deterring housing development in our city. So please take a look. I wanted to get staff's answer on the IP 2.9, 2.10 language, if I could do that before I continue my comments.
Sure, so the connection we're trying to make is the council wanted housing to move forward in phases. And so the signature project is the only exception in which they could move forward unless you were 100% affordable or had the general plan designation of residential. That's the point we're trying to make, because those policies discuss phasing.
So is there a policy in the general plan where that's stated? Where the words exceptional and awesome and
Well, no, the
greatest
word.
in
It
the
says
world are
catalyst in the
included?
signature project policy
So the word
itself.
signature implies a sort of an exception, an exemplary project. The word exemplary is not in there, but that's, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, David, you were there, that that's, the word signature implies it's something special.
So in fact, there is no use of the word exceptional in the general plan. This was created by staff in the presentation. And this is the problem, is it's revisionist history. When the task force met originally, we had 51 meetings. I attended 49 of the 51. And this construct of horizons and urban village plans being required to do housing, those of us in the development industry said, that's going to prevent housing from getting built. And we suggested, well, what if someone comes forward with a really good project? You know, it's mixed use, it's well-designed, it makes sense. A good project. Nobody said the best project in history, exceptional project, a good project. And over the last 8 years, staff has fabricated this notion that the job requirement has to be above and beyond the average density plan for that urban village. That's just been a fabrication of staff. And so my recommendation on the job density is that it should be a good project that meets the job density plan for the urban village. That's it.
Eric, is there a question or?
Well, my first question was, where's the language that says exceptional, extraordinary, awesome, best in the world? It's not in the general plan. And
Well, Eric, so I think what we want to do is, we're not going to be spending 51 meetings here. And we don't want to necessarily go into the whole history of urban villages either. We just don't have time for that. You were one of the supporters, if not one of the authors, of the idea of trying to have some flexibility in the plan to allow better than average, I won't use the word exceptional, but I think you were the person who used the word signature, projects like that, to make sure that projects that are good, that are better, move forward, and that we don't do anything in the general plan that deters that kind of work. And so we came up with some language. It was broad. It wasn't specific like these standards are. And so the issue, though, we have to deal with now is simply this. We're going to move to standards. We're required to. That's my understanding. The issue then becomes, what are going to be the standards? And so I'd like to keep our discussion going in that way. I'm not suggesting that anything you're saying is wrong, but we have to deal with the issues that the council's asked us to do and that state law mandates us to have to deal with now. So we're going to go to standards.
yeah, so I'm not arguing against standards, so let me
Okay.
put a motion on the floor.
All right?
So I recommend that we include all of the staff standards with these changes. One change will be to job density, that the standard should be that the project meet the average planned job density for that urban village. That is an explicit standard. Not plus 10%, not plus 15%, but meet the average planned job density for that urban village. And the other change would be on the site selection requirement. Because we're hearing from staff that if you're off by even half a foot, you're not in compliance. So because of that, the 3 acres and the 150 foot of frontage is just too big. There are very few 3-acre sites even in the whole city. So I would recommend that we go down to 1.5 acres, which is consistent with the affordable housing criteria, 1.5 acres, and that the frontage could be 100 feet.
Second.
And- Yeah.
Okay.
I see your comment. Who seconded your motion? Michael? Yes, we shall. So we have a second. Let's have discussion. Yes, clarifying question. Roberta?
Unless we're just gonna vote on this, but.
No, we don't need to.
Can you go ahead one slide? Just, can you go ahead one slide on this?
Michael, we'll get to you. We'll finish on this side and then we'll come back around.
How many signature projects were submitted since these 8 have been approved?
I believe we have 8 total. We had one submitted 2 days ago.
So 8 were submitted.
Roberta, can you speak into the mic for the recording purposes?
So 7 were submitted and 7 were approved.
We have 6 approved. We have 2 outstanding.
Okay, 6 approved out of, okay. 6 out of 8 have been, okay.
Correct.
And then so I'm looking at page 8 of the memo, and there's 7 listed, and 4 of the 7 do not meet the commercial requirements. And have these been approved, or will they not be approved until they meet them?
They've been approved
Okay.
at the fair share,
Fair share, but it's not.
which is what the average density that Eric is referencing.
So there's a middle column that says provided by project, and 4 were below. 9%, 0%, 0.1%, and 3%.
That means that that's the percentage above the fair share, which is the average density.
But it's requiring 10 to 15%.
No, that's in the, oh, you're saying with the proposed.
Actually, the proposed requires 10% on each of these. 4 of the 7 are below. I'm supporting his motion because it looks like to get these approved, they're coming in lower.
Exactly.
And if you want to keep getting housing built, whether you like it or not, actually, so only 3 met the requirements.
Right, and the point we're making in the third bullet point is that the other 3 that didn't are only 1,800 square feet behind the requirements that would be imposed.
Actually, I think even less. I think some of them are like 100 feet below.
Is that possible? Because it says point.
okay.
I don't think so. I'm looking at the numbers. That's not true.
Okay.
That is not true. 0.1% to 10%, 3% to 10%.
I'm sorry, I was
Oh,
looking
I
at
see
the
what
wrong
you're saying.
column.
What?
I was looking at the
Maybe,
wrong
maybe
column.
I'm not reading this right. I just, if you want buildings built, make it work so the buildings get built.
Great. Let's take some more comments. We'll go Shiloh. I don't know if that's Pat or Kevin. Okay. We'll just come on down this way. Go for it.
Quick question for staff to clarify the
We're going to come back around.
community outreach.
As I
piece of
said.
it. It says, is Michael complaining? On the community outreach piece, it says equal to or more community meetings. So if a project comes before the planning commission, using an example I'm familiar with, and they've done 2 community meetings, do we on the planning commission have leeway to say, gee, we wish you had done more? Or is that kind of, that's the prescriptive, if you've done 2, even though we wish you might have done some more, they've met the requirement?
Right, all they need to do is 2.
Can we move on? Do you have another part of your question? Okay. Kevin?
I was gonna make similar comments that Eric made around just changing that standard to meeting the average jobs density, because it seems to be a barrier to, we would have more than 8 signature projects if the job density. So I'm gonna support that.
Great. Thank you. Asen?
So really quickly, just a couple of Me Too's to Councilmember Arenas. I do think that the question really isn't about the number of community meetings that you have. It's about the quality and whose voices are actually being included in the decision-making around these kinds of signature projects. So hopefully there'll be some report back about the kinds of community meetings and community feedback we're getting on these projects. The second is around Jesse's comment about having an equity and anti-displacement analysis to be done on signature projects when they do come forward. The second thing I would add is I know we're looking at a lot of objective standards, but I think some of the non-objective standards that we had talked about world-class and design and that kind of thing, some of it was somewhat valuable. Is any of that still going to be considered when projects are coming forward? Just on a, obviously not a yes or no question, but more of a thing that staff is going to be considering. Second question is, are you thinking about any other project components that could potentially make a signature project, something like affordability or job standards? And then lastly, I just want to ask a question about those job density standards that both Kevin and Eric just mentioned. Is that something that would have any impact on having that kind of complete community that we are trying to get with a signature project?
So Asen, your first comment was about qualitative standards. Your second one was about job standards. I couldn't hear your third one. Just very quickly.
The last one
Very
was
quickly.
just trying to figure out exactly what the impact of the change to the job density would be.
Thank you. Why don't we keep going with questions, and if staff has time to respond to those, that'd be great. Juan?
So I have a question and then I have a comment. The question is, whatever requirements we approve today, when would they be revisited in the future?
Someone want to talk about the process? This is a 4-year review.
A brief answer is fine.
Every 4 years, we do a comprehensive review of the general plan, and the policy can be reanalyzed and changed.
Okay. So we tested whatever the process was or the criteria were for 4 years, and now we're just going to test another set of criteria. And I am in favor
Well, these all
of-
go to council, of course.
Yeah. So I'm in favor of what Eric proposed. My reasoning is we hear about the plight of families, of insufficient housing, of gentrification, of high rents, high mortgages. And one of the factors is obviously the supply of housing. The more housing, the less gentrification, or the more similar opportunities that exist, the lower that rents and mortgages will go up or maybe even drop. And so I think that if there are barriers to development that have inhibited that we need to remove some of them. And so I definitely support this.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been the direction of this whole four-year review and these conversations. So thank you so much. Melanie?
Thank you. So I've got a question about the open space requirements and the difference between the amount that's being required for the neighborhood villages versus the regional transit urban village. And my question is really whether the amount being asked of the neighborhood villages is too little and whether the amount being asked of the regional transit urban villages may be too much. Just kind of from looking at what we're asking of the signature projects within those sites, it seems to me that the residential density as well as the commercial density is lower for neighborhood village, which would suggest that there would actually be more space available on those sites to provide open space versus the regional transit urban village. But I'm not sure if I'm not thinking of it correctly, but maybe staff could speak to that.
Sure. So generally speaking, the neighborhood villages are in more suburban portions of the city, and they're actually smaller villages. Some of them ranging between 14 acres, 30 acres. They're not very large in comparison to some of our larger villages, which are 100 acres, 150 acres, 200 acres. And so that's kind of where just the scale of what could actually happen for projects is where we're trying to be sensitive to that, both with the density. And so for neighborhood villages, the density is lower because of its context. And the general plan actually has policies and encouragement for this to be the case when you're near established single-family neighborhoods. And then we actually, in many of our urban village plans, have 2,000 square feet set as the base minimum for our open space, our publicly accessible open space. And so that's where we took that from, not wanting to reinvent the wheel. As far as regional transit, so thinking Barry Sabart, larger projects, larger villages. And so just to provide context, you've seen the Bascom Station, the DEC Center project come through. They had almost an acre of publicly accessible open space, and they were a commercial corridor village. That's nowhere near the 5,000. Like 5,000 is just a small portion of what that acre was that they provided on site, and they didn't have an issue providing that. So we're actually undershooting the space or the requirement that could be provided. We just don't want to preclude anything because parcel sizes, depending on if you aggregate, if you're able to acquire more properties, it's open to the market and if you can purchase. So we want to have flexibility.
But wouldn't it make sense, I guess, I understand like within the neighborhood context that you've got a more suburban scale or more urban scale, but we're talking about development standards that are being applied to a particular parcel. And obviously, what a particular is reasonable for a particular parcel seems to be tied to how big that parcel is. And I understand that we don't have a size constraint on the corner lots, but we do have a size constraint on the interior lots as being proposed. And it seems like we might consider something more as a percentage of the overall square footage of the lot as opposed to something arbitrary. Because if it's a 5-acre corner parcel and they only have to provide 2,000 square feet of open space, that's nothing, even in a suburban context. So maybe that might be something that staff might consider.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 3 more comments. Eddie, Michael, and then Linda has a quick comment, and then David has a process suggestion.
And then we need to respond to Asen's questions.
I have a question for staff, which is how do you calculate the average jobs density for the signature project process?
Do you want to do that one?
You can.
So, I mean, we basically look at the number of jobs, and it's actually, the general plan has a formula. It's based on 300 square feet of commercial space per job. And so you have an overall square footage of commercial space that needs to be planned for and accommodated in a village. And then you basically break that up. So it's by, each parcel gets their share of that. So if their parcel, it consists of 5% of the overall acreage of land in the village that's suitable for commercial space, then they get 5% of that square footage number.
Okay, I just want to make a comment that for existing parcels of land that are already jobs rich or have are doing far above and beyond their fair share in terms of existing commercial uses. Now, I'm not advocating for a conversion of employment uses to non-employment uses. What I think is that for those sites where it's already jobs rich, there shouldn't be an additional commercial requirement on top of the signature project process. For those companies like Apple and others who are announcing major investments of housing onto their plots of land, we should recognize those sites that are already going above and beyond the jobs production requirement and allow those parcels of land to balance out the housing on those particular sites. That's the comment that I would like to make there.
So if I can just clarify, so what you're saying is if Apple built, let's say, a 200,000 square foot office building in an urban village, let's say South Bascom, then you would deduct that from sort of the overall goal as being built already, and then the signature project fair share would be calculated on a lower number.
There should be some kind of a credit process for those sites that
Okay.
have already existing commercial uses.
Thanks, Eddie. Okay, Michael.
Speaking to the motion and regarding eliminating the additional requirement for the commercial, we have several projects, one of which will be on a transit station. Having additional commercial requirements, first of all, is very difficult in this retail environment, number one. Number two, that kind of commercial requirement requires parking, especially even in a lot of our suburban areas. And number three, a real example, there's a need in this particular community that I'm building in, one that I grew up in, it doesn't have it doesn't have a community center, doesn't have community spaces to gather. In this particular instance, that commercial would not be met if I built an additional community room, even though it was on the ground floor, even though it looked like a commercial facility, it wouldn't be counted as commercial use. So I really hope that this task force, this is the single biggest hurdle to this signature project. I'm one of the only developers on this, and I can speak to it with a lot of credibility. Thank you.
That's helpful, thanks. Linda had a comment, and then.
I did. I'm assuming staff put a lot of time into their recommendations here. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are with regard to what Eric is suggesting, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Yeah, I mean, so just a reminder that one of the criteria in
The gentle lady from Campbell is.
one of the criteria, the signature project does talk about it. It says providing above and beyond. So I think what the task force is having a conversation about, what there shouldn't be above and beyond requirements. Staff is advocating that is one of the criteria of the Urban Village Plan. It should be above and beyond. And so for us, we're trying to define, well, what is above and beyond? And so what we did is we said the above and beyond in a neighborhood village would be 5% or 10% in a larger village, whatever. So we're trying to define what that above and beyond is.
And I think some of the other comments that you've heard is about involving the community and defining what those are. It could be a community room per Michael's comment.
And we do count community rooms if essentially if they're publicly accessible spaces that, I mean, if they function as a space that is
Okay,
a commercial operated space that's open to the public.
Okay.
If
thank
it's
you.
an internal type of use.
Can I have Asen ask his very quick
Well, I
final
never answered
comment, and then
We
you
never answered
respond?
Asen's
I know,
questions.
and then you'll respond, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, I just want to ask a really quick clarifying question about whether or not community rooms or even just like rooms that only residents can use but are still street facing and have some kind of street activation would be able to count for that commercial space.
No, they cannot, because the goal is to have job-producing uses.
Correct.
That's what we're trying to satisfy under our general plan.
So that's the difference between active uses, those could be called active uses versus commercial uses. The idea here is actually, again, is to try to grow the jobs and the housing in a mixed-use environment where people can meet a lot of their daily needs in close proximity. So back to some of your questions, I think, Asen. So were there other criteria considered? I was not part of the task force process at this point in time, 8 years ago, so I can't speak to that. Maybe David remembers. But, or maybe Eric remembers, but the last 4-year review, what was discussed is about including requirements for affordable housing as part of a signature project. The task force decided not to move forward with that recommendation, but it was put on the table. Staff at this time is not proposing additional criteria requirements. Let's see, you had other questions?
You asked about affordability, and if we can include an affordability component. That's not something that we are currently exploring, but can be looked into. We rely upon the requirements of our partners in the housing department with their inclusionary ordinance, and so that's where the developer can satisfy it. We don't say don't provide affordable housing on site, and definitely would encourage it, but it's not a requirement. And you asked about using subjective standards to kind of help analyze the project. So state law says you can't use them to make your determination if they comply or don't comply with the policy. And ultimately, when you're making your findings on a project about whether or not you will approve or not, it's based on objective criteria. So not your feelings, not if you think it's the right color red. It has values assigned to it and doesn't meet those values. Yes, you may not like it, but we have to follow that.
That being said, we will work with the applicant to create the best project I think as possible. So we have design values, and so it's more of a conversation than if you don't do what I say, we're going to recommend
So,
denial.
Michael,
Right,
can
they
you
can
respond to
volunteer.
the earlier questions that he had, or did you respond to all
There
of
was
them?
one
Are you
more
done?
about the complete community goals. So, I mean, I can't speak, that's a hard one to sort of wrap. So, I mean, I think we're kind of discussing at the edges here, but I think, you know, it depends on the site. So I can't say, does the commercial requirement at your fair share, not above fair share, meet the sort of complete community goals? It may or may not. It's really hard to say. Yeah, it just depends. I mean, it could be fine meeting the fair share. It may be that in some cases it's really not one way or the other.
Okay, we're going to go to Councilmember Davis. I see several other questions here. We're going to go to David afterwards for a process comment, and then come back.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the discussion. And Eric, I appreciate your motion. Roberta, I'm very sensitive to the points that you made about which signature projects would not meet the criteria. And they're, even in just the gross acres, it would kick out even what we're talking about, they would kick out a couple of signature projects. But I'm also very sensitive to the fact that we do have a jobs deficit in this city. And I wanted to know, I'd like to hear from Eric, from Michael, and others, what they think about maybe amending the motion to the requirement for the jobs, meet the average jobs density for that urban village, or keep the commercial square footage that's on that site, whichever is greater. Because there are some bigger sites, so I'm sensitive to the DEC Center, which is in my district, where they're exceeding their fair share of commercial, but it's also a really large commercial site. And so they're basically keeping the percent or the square footage of commercial that's there already, and maybe adding to it, but a little bit. But I'd like to know what others think of that as a possible amendment.
Well, we're going to hold off on that because, and we will come to that idea. I don't want to put an end to that, but if you look at our agenda a moment, we had a time certain item that we're already a half an hour behind based on a consultant who's here and who's going to make a presentation. Teresa was going through the recommendations in order of the ones we thought would go the quickest, and this one's requiring more time. We want to give more time to it, not less. So in the interest of doing that, what we'd like to do at this time is we're going to go forward with, I think it's items 4 and 5 on our agenda. When that's done, we're going to return to this discussion, and I'm going to suggest a point of order, too, on that before we consider amendments to the motion or a vote on the motion, we might as well just take up the issue of the horizons as well, because the signature project issue is interrelated with that. I could make more comments on that. I'm not going to do that because we're already behind time, but I guess there's just one thing I do want to remind people here. I'm sensing a confusion that when we talk about these criteria, I'm not saying everyone's of this view, but in some of the comments, I'm starting to pick up that people are believing that this is an impediment to all urban villages. These are the minimum requirements for signature projects. There aren't minimum requirements for urban villages. And what we're really talking about here is if you look at pages 4 and 5 of the staff report, the key difference for signature projects is those projects can move ahead without an urban village plan. And so that was the idea way back when we were talking about this, is that maybe somebody comes along with a project that's just so compelling and so good on its face. There wasn't a need to engage the public and go through the urban village process. So we need to keep that in mind here, that if you're going to reduce the standards to so low that a project only has to be 100 feet wide, you know what the width of that is? That's the width of 2 residential properties. A property can be that small and can go forward without a plan or without community involvement. We need to keep that in mind too. So let's keep that in mind. We're going to go forward with these other items now. We'll take up the discussion of this after our informational presentation.
So Q-Launch, so that we can move from item 4 and 5, concurrently or subsequently, can you please go ahead and define flex housing before we start, and then we'll have Dan start and Adam follow.
So missing middle housing, where Dan will talk about a variety of ranges of housing types and densities, while flex housing is more narrow to our scope of work, the City Council approved, which is 2 to 4 units, so duplex, triplex, and fourplexes.
Thank you very much. Dan, please.
Just really quickly, I think the term of art is missing middle housing, but we're not using that term in San Jose because missing middle housing in San Jose has been used to talk about affordability, really, and as Dan will talk about, this is about affordability, but more than that. So it's to alleviate confusion.
Thank you. Dan, welcome. Thank you for being here. Please.
Well, thank you, co-chairs, and thank you to the rest of the task force. So I created this concept of missing middle housing about 7 years ago to address 2 issues that continue to grow. The first one is the growing gap between the types of housing that many households across the country want and what's being delivered for various reasons in terms of obstacles. The second one gets to part of the conversation you've been having here as well. It's the growing affordability gap and just the challenge of households for both rentals and for sale housing to achieve housing stability. And so it's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about missing middle housing. And I think one of the reasons that this concept has caught on so broadly now around the world is that it's given communities a way to talk about and communicate about housing choices without using scary terms like density. How many neighborhoods do you feel are going to be sort of celebrating if you come into their neighborhood and say, hey, we want to increase the density in your neighborhood, right? It's density, multifamily, upzoning, all these terms that come with a lot of baggage. And missing middle housing gives communities, developers, cities a way to frame this conversation in a way that's approachable, understandable, and you can build support for. This is a photo of a courtyard housing project in Santa Barbara, California. 20 years ago, one of our very first projects was with Santa Barbara County it was a master plan for Isla Vista. And if you know Isla Vista, it's sort of the multifamily student housing up against the university. In the middle doesn't quite know what it wants to be, and then single family housing to the north of that. And the second we walked in the door as a consultant, the Citizen Advisory Group said, we have a message. We don't want more than 17 dwelling units per acre, period. And it took us really off guard because we hadn't even started a conversation yet. And what was it about 17 that was magic and 17.1 was too much, or why wasn't it 15.5? Or some other numbers. So we did just a very logical thing, and we took them on a walking tour through pre-1940s neighborhoods adjacent to downtown Santa Barbara, and you could do the exact same thing in your neighborhoods here in San Jose, especially the ones sort of built pre-1940s. And we saw, right, all these neighborhoods are laboratories for these missing middle types, cottage courts, duplexes, fourplexes. And we came to this courtyard apartment building, and everybody was super excited about this. And I said, well, if we can create a plan and we can write a set of new form-based standards to get this in Isla Vista, would you support it? And they're like, absolutely. And so me and my team went out and we counted the meters, we counted the doorbells, did some quick calculations, and we said, well, by the way, this building generates a density of about 45 dwelling units per acre. And so what that did is it immediately shifted the conversation away from a very random number and a concept of density and more toward form and scale and housing choices and housing types. And so that's really primarily what this concept is about. And cities across the country are using it in different ways. And so I like to start a little bit by talking about sort of why this is an important conversation. I'm going to do all of these slides fairly quickly so that we have time for Q&A at the end. But right, there's some tremendous shifts in household demographics that caught everybody, cities and developers, off guard post-recession. 1/3 of all households are single-person households. Do you think that 1/3 of the housing that's being built or is available on the market, either for rent or for sale, is designed specifically for a single-person household? Absolutely not. By 2025, up to 85% of households will not have children. Once again, big impact on the type of housing that we need to be delivering. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. This is why AARP is really interested in this conversation. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then 60% of the nation's population growth will be Latino population. And so, right, once again, we're much more diverse. And so we need to be thinking about how all of these shifts impact the types of housing that we're enabling and the barriers that we're removing to deliver those housing choices. There's also this growing demand for walkable living. The two biggest market segments, the baby boomers, ages 55 to 64, and the millennials. 2/3 of millennials want walkable urban living, and 1/3 of the baby boomers want walkable urban living. And I'm not an economist, but I can tell you that a really simple economic equation of high demand and low supply equals really high housing prices, and that's why the entire Bay Area and cities all across the country, these walkable neighborhoods are sort of growing in prices, both in rental and for sale, right? This is pretty shocking that right now 31% of all American households are cost burdened, and I would imagine it's probably even higher here in the South Bay. That means that they're spending more than 1/3 of their income on housing. So this is, right, this keeps growing and growing and growing, and we've been trying to figure out some solutions. And what I'd say is a missing middle is just one of the many tools that cities can be looking at. The last issue that I like to just reinforce is that our zoning has been very ineffective in delivering these housing choices. It's also given density a very bad name. I was talking with your staff this afternoon, the dingbat apartments that got built in the 1950s and 60s into the 80s. This isn't even the worst of the examples, but right, that got neighborhoods, and for very good reasons, up in arms about not wanting density, not wanting multifamily, because this is what they envision when you use those terms, and this is what the zoning delivered when in sort of the series of those 3 or 4 decades. There's also a tremendous disconnect that we find in our work between walkable contexts. So this is Medford, Oregon, and the dotted ellipses are where walkable urban contexts exists in their city, and the red is where they allow multi-unit housing. And so the most logical place to allow it is the exact opposite of where their zoning is actually enabling it. So there's often that big disconnect in the maps. And then, right, you probably all saw this article in the New York Times that a lot of cities, including San Jose, has a very high percentage of their residentially zoned land that's zoned only for single-family homes. 94% of your residential zone land is zoned for only single family, right? That's a big number. Something you all need to be thinking about as you move forward in your conversation. So what is missing middle? I'm sure you've probably seen this diagram. Can I just get a showing of hands of how many people have actually seen the missing middle diagram? So this is, we created this about 6 years ago. We're glad to see it being used. Left-hand side of the diagram in white are single-family housing types, which we all know zoning did a great job. There's industries that know how to deliver this in high quantities. On the right-hand side are those 4, 5, 6, 7+ story condos or apartment buildings that over the course of the last 15 years, right, our planning has figured it out, developers have figured out, almost any market in the country is delivering that. It's all of these types in the middle. The courtyard apartment, the cottage court, the duplex, the fourplex, townhouses even in a lot of instances that make up a great percentage of a lot of the highly desirable neighborhoods built in the pre-1940s, but we've basically put so many barriers in place that we built very, very little of these over the course of the last 60 and 70 years. And this is a really, really important point to make, is that missing middle housing is middle in two different ways. First and foremost, it's a middle scale, right? These are housing types that we call house scale that are they're basically the same size as a house. They just happen to have multiple units in it. And then the second way that they're middle is they have been proven to deliver affordability to middle income households by design without any sort of subsidy. So it usually starts at about 60% median income and up, and anything below that, any household with incomes below that would typically need subsidy, but they're very effective at delivering that level of affordability for middle income households. A couple of things to remember about house scale is it's not just height, right? Zoning codes have done a really good job of regulating height, but very few of them actually regulate a maximum width of a building and the maximum depth of a building. And we actually always recommend to our city clients to actually regulate all of those characteristics to effectively deliver house scale. So once again, if you were to walk by or drive by or ride your bike by this building, you would probably never guess that it wasn't a single family house. It's actually a triplex, right, that looks and feels and behaves like a single-family house. And that's the real core concept behind missing middle. It's super basic, but we've forgotten how to deliver it. We've put so many barriers in place to deliver it. So this is really, if you're going to take one thing away from this conversation, missing middle is primarily about house-scale buildings with multiple units that sort of are this, a colleague of mine, Brent Toderin from Vancouver, calls it gentle density. So it's another way to talk about it. We created this barbell image where you have subsidized housing on one side, important part of the affordability conversation. You have increase in supply as another important part of the affordability conversation. And missing middle fits right in the middle, where if the barriers are removed, and you give folks like Adam here, the small developers, the ability to deliver it, it can deliver that attainability or affordability to those middle income households. So really, really powerful tool to think about. Less than 10% of all housing units built between 1990 and 2013 were missing middle scale, which means 19 units and under 2.5 stories. So you can see the line is smaller and smaller percentages. We can talk about those reasons. I just wanted to mention that the concept we're very excited to see has become very much a movement. It's being applied in New South Wales, Australia. Toronto's created their own version of the diagram. It's just really exciting to see how it is spreading and being used to frame the conversations, right? San Luis Obispo, California, great mix of missing middle types. Santa Barbara, I mentioned it earlier, great little cottage court in the middle, courtyard housing types, fourplexes. Your very own missing middle housing here, some great fourplexes on the right-hand side there, duplexes, triplexes. I've got a catalog of about 20 years of even San Jose missing middle photographs that it's always fun to go back and look through. Sacramento, right? All of these neighborhoods built prior to the 1940s have these types. And part of the reason you don't notice them is because they're house scale and they blend into the neighborhoods. So a quick overview of the types, and this is really important because once again, it's about this mental shift and really this strategic shift about thinking about density and thinking more specifically about form, scale, and building types. And I'd like to just continue to reinforce that. At one point in time, you used to be able to open a Sears and Roebuck catalog, this is from 1903, and purchase a fourplex from Sears and Roebuck for $2,300. And I think we ultimately need to get to that point where these missing middle types can be delivered in a container or in a couple of pieces and delivered to communities. But I just wanted to mention that we used to know how to deliver these in mass quantities and sort of in a production way. So the duplex, the side-by-side duplex generates a density. Once again, I don't like starting the conversation about density, but just to give you a reference point, about 20 units per acre in 1- and 2-story versions. People are always surprised to hear that these great little bungalow courts, often with very small units, 400, 500, 600 square feet detached houses, can generate densities of the mid-30 units per acre, 33, 35 units per acre, and a lot of the great historic examples. Fourplex is my favorite type. Looks like a house, 2 units on the ground floor, 2 units on the upper floor. Once again, generate sort of the mid-30 units per acre on a typical lot size of about 50. I often give cities a little test is take any of your zoning districts, medium density residential districts, and see if a fourplex is allowed on a 50-foot wide lot, which is sort of the trigger point. They should be allowed on any 50-foot wide lot in a medium density zoning district, but most cities require bigger lot sizes than that. They can generate a pretty broad range of densities based on the amount of parking that is required to provided. So you can imagine that the 49 dwelling units per acre that a fourplex can generate with no parking on site, and then the 21 dwelling units per acre that just one space per unit. So it's a big difference in the yield and ultimately the cost either to rent or to purchase one of those units. So something to consider. The townhouse, I'm about to take this off the missing middle list because there are townhouses being built, but it is still a really good type. I still highly encourage it, and there's still a lot of cities that actually don't have effective zoning for delivering housing types. And what I say is that townhouses are not all the same, right? You can have block-long townhouses, like in a Brooklyn. You can have 2 townhouses, two units side by side that feel like a house, 3 or 4. So I just encourage careful consideration when enabling this. Also, right, there's kind of this little bit of a plague of what Denver has called the slot home. It's townhouses that are delivered perpendicular to the street that go deep into the lot and don't really create a really good urban form or high quality public spaces. So I just tell cities to be really careful about what you enable. You can allow these and just make sure that they are addressing the street effectively, but you just need to be very thoughtful about it. Small multiplexes, this example on the left is a really great example right off of First Street here in San Jose. I think that's 5 units, but I could be wrong. And then a newly built example on the right-hand side in Austin, Texas, a little 6-plex unit that delivers about the low 40 units per acre. So 2 stories, right, 40 units per acre. That's a really nice tile, the type that I showed you earlier. And then I just like to use this to wake people up a little bit and maybe give a little bit of a quiz of how high of a density does somebody guess how dense they think this great little 2-story apartment courtyard building is on a 100 by 100 foot lot. Anybody want to throw out a density calculation? I heard 60. Anybody else? 75, 40. Okay, so we did a missing middle walking tour in Sacramento about 1.5 years ago. Everybody on the tour loved this, and we calculated the density, and this is 90 units per acre. And I can guarantee you if your general plan says 90 units per acre, it's not thinking about a cute little 2-story cottage court. And so we encourage cities to create separate land use districts that are like missing middle high density or small footprint high density to try to encourage these types of it achieves those densities with smaller units and no off-street parking. But we ran into a woman who was taking her groceries into her apartment, and she said she really living in this place. I just wanted to focus on one important characteristic because it's always one of the most heated and challenging conversations in a city. It's parking. And for some reason, cities have just done a much better job delivering spaces for cars than delivering housing for people. And that needs to change, and cities need to prioritize, is parking more important or is housing more important? And right, never an easy conversation, but one that needs to happen. We found that in most markets, if you're requiring more than one off-street parking space per unit, and in more high-value markets, it might even be lower than that, you're not gonna get, developers can't make missing middle housing pencil out. So just encouraging, I like to use this Banksy image to get city to be thinking creatively about parking and to have that conversation and make sure they tackle that as part of their housing conversation and missing middle conversation. So the concept, I'm going to go through these very quickly, is being applied very broadly at a statewide scale, citywide scale, neighborhood scale, small area plan scale. And so I just wanted to give some really good examples of how this is being applied, right? This has been a banner year for both state and citywide policy to enable missing middle across the country. Earlier this year, Minneapolis took a very progressive action and adopted a comprehensive plan that eliminated single-family zoning citywide to enable 3 units on every lot at a minimum. And their directive here was they have one of the biggest discrepancies in ownership between white households and non-white households, and they're using missing middle to try to help sort of fill that gap between ownership and equity in housing. Very recently, the state of Oregon passed HB 2001, which basically enables 2 units on any lot in the entire state in cities of less than 10,000 people. And cities over 25,000 people, it allows up to 4 units on any lot. So they've basically eliminated single-family zoning in the entire state of Oregon as of, I think it's January or February of this year. So they are taking action and being very progressive and getting ahead of their housing conversation. Missing middle is being used very effectively to communicate about these housing needs. This is a yard sign that I took a photograph of in the state of Washington that says, "I am missing middle." It's about sort of a resident sort of making a statement that there is a need for them, for the type of housing, missing middle housing, for them to be able to stay in these neighborhoods to sort of relieve that pressure of being pushed out and the gentrification. And okay, if AARP is talking about this, it's a pretty mainstream need. And we were hired by AARP about 1.5 years ago to educate their 38 million members about the need for walkable living, but also this need for more diverse housing choices in missing middle. So we've done webinars, we've done walking tours. So it's great that an organization like AARP is advocating for this. I'm not going to mention, you can look this up online. The city of Brisbane, Australia, did this really great online scenarios game that enabled residents to go online and decide what they wanted the future growth of Brisbane to be, and missing middle was the middle. On the left-hand side there, it's a little bit fuzzy, but was the middle option, and it would show you different outcomes based on whether you picked single-family home percentage, missing middle percentage, or mid-rise percentage of open space, travel time, quality of life. I just encourage you to go take a look at that online. It is also informing small area plans, and this is just one example that we're working on. We're doing a specific plan for downtown Davis, California, that's heavily influenced by missing middle, where the areas that you see in the sort of lighter red around the downtown core that were built historically as single-family homes, the zoning is being changed to enable this scale of missing middle housing very specifically to allow for the evolution of those edges and accommodation of the housing choices within their downtown, within walking distance of the Amtrak station and the university as well. And just wanted to mention that, right, there's all different ways you can take missing middle. They wanted to focus also on the sustainability aspects of missing middle, so we did a series of sustainability overlays for Davis, and that was a fun process. The city of Mountain View, California, we just were hired by them to assess their R3 zoning district. They're basically, what's happening is that's where a lot of their existing affordable housing stock is. It's being torn down and replaced by luxury townhouses. Fewer units, higher value, and so they're wanting to get ahead of that, or sort of try to get their arms around that and think about if missing middle can play a role in delivering more attainable, more affordable housing choices instead of the luxury townhouses that are being built. The city of Portland's been very progressive in adjusting their zoning to enable missing middle housing, and just encourage you to take a look at it. They're actually increasing allowed FAR for residential uses. If you add more units, you get more FAR. So it's trying to discourage the McMansion, encourage the missing middle housing type. So really, really refined strategy. It's also being used in regional and general plans. SACOG is using the missing middle housing in their housing policy toolkit. San Diego County is using it as part of their affordable housing strategy. The city of Nashville, I mean, it feels like a bit of a stretch, but they've been the most progressive, I think, starting about 15 years ago. They had a very progressive planning director, and they started enabling missing middle housing 15 years ago, and have really delivered a lot of really high quality missing middle housing across the city of Nashville as the market gets hotter and hotter there. Just wanted to mention Cincinnati, Ohio, because it's a fairly similar application where we worked with the city on a comprehensive plan that defined 42 walkable urban neighborhoods that became priorities for the city, much like your urban villages. And we wrote a form-based code, a series of form-based zoning districts that what you see here is this is the of the small footprint neighborhood. And what this table shows is we specifically allow a range of missing middle housing types within the development standards within that zoning district. So we just get really direct about saying, in this neighborhood, it's this zoning district, here's the palette of missing middle types that are enabled in that zone. And so that's what we often encourage. I'm just gonna skip through this for sake of time, but I just wanted to, I'm gonna spend a few minutes on zoning just because it's kind of one of my passions, and I think it's really the first barrier that cities need to remove to get developers thinking about this, to get industries thinking about, get banks to think about this. But most zoning codes cannot tell the difference between the building on the right and the building on the left, right? It's the same height, it's the same density, it's the same setbacks, but I think we can all say that they're not sort of the same in terms of what they add to the community or reinforcing the public realm. And I think one of the important aspects of the missing middle is just getting specific with the objective standards that can be delivered to ensure that you get the building on the left and not the building on the right. And I think that's an important message to community members, that you're not going to get the dingbat apartments. You are definitely, you can walk through the objective standards and show how you're going to get that building on the left, not the building on the right. And I think a lot of my recent presentations, especially with the American Planning Association, have been like the top 10 zoning hacks for missing middle housing, and we've been doing a lot of really strategic targeted zoning adjustments, whether it be dialing up the density, dialing down the parking, dialing down required open space. You got to be careful about that. I'm just putting that up there. It's can become a really big barrier for these types, so you just need to be thoughtful about it. Mapping more broadly to enable missing middle, and just being careful about what's being enabled. And so there's just a really good resource that we worked on. This isn't just being talked about in planning circles. Realtors we're actually being hired by realtors, the Realtors, National Association of Realtors, NAHB hired us to do this assessment of 35 cities, different zoning techniques for enabling missing middle that was released earlier this year. Just encourage you to take a quick peek at that. And then a couple of concluding thoughts here is just, I focused this presentation on public sector, cities, local jurisdictions, states. The other half of our work is with developers. We do both the master planning and the design of missing middle with developers. And so I'll tell you that when the barriers are removed, the developers respond. And it's usually the small local developers like Adam here, who are the first out of the gate, that understand the market. They kind of know what the market's looking for. They understand the neighborhoods. And I think it's just been great to see the multifamily developers have responded. We've seen great missing middle multifamily projects, and we've seen great missing middle sort of developers who were single-family detached that are evolving into the missing middle housing types, which is just great to see. And I'm going to pound the drum here, right? If you use the density term, you get zapped. Everybody gets a zapper. So let's stop using the term density. Let's get away from these terms that and effectively frame this conversation, because it's buildings like this one, or even worse, that neighbors, community members think about when you start using those terms. So let's make this approachable and start thinking more specifically about form and scale and building type and these great missing middle types. I just encourage you, if you are interested in more information, we launched an online resource at missingmiddlehousing.com 4 years ago to get the information out there. And spring of next year, my book from Island Press on missing middle housing will be available. So I just encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at that. But I like to close with a little bit of a call to action. And this is a great sort of extract or quote from a publication by the Urban Land Institute called What's Next? And it's time to rethink and evolve and reinvent and renew. And why I like this is because whether you're a community member, whether you're a planner, an architect, a developer, a decision maker, city manager, planning director, a real estate agent, I really do feel that everybody plays a role in enabling their cities to evolve, adapt, and change and meet this shifting demand for walkable living, as well as this real need for more attainable and affordable housing. And so it's just like the market is ready, and I sort of challenge cities to respond and respond quickly to these needs for missing middle housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Great examples. Let's just move right on into Adam Maybury and his presentation about flex housing.
While they're getting that up, one of the things I like to is for cities to personalize the conversation about missing middle, because most of us either lived in missing middle at some point in their lives, have a brother or sister or a mother, grandmother. When I was growing up, I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. My great-grandmother lived in a great little Victorian side-by-side duplex that was a block and a half from the main street, and everything she needed, number one, was in that little 500 square foot unit, but also within a 10-minute walk of her unit. So I like that personalization of the conversation.
Yeah, that's fine. This is fine. Zoom it to, where is it? Yeah, go. Oh, there you go. Hello. I just want to thank whoever invited Daniel to speak. Did a lot of the heavy lifting on the missing middle side, as a
nation's advocate in this type of housing. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to follow him. You had the architect talking about planning, now you have the architect talking about development here. So I'm Adam Mayberry. I'm born and raised in San Jose. Like I said, I'm an architect. After going to Cal Poly, I actually had the opportunity to study under some of the premier architect developers in San Diego, a lot of which who transformed portions of the city that are either became popular in the 90s to early 2000s and are currently redeveloping and making the most hip neighborhoods in San Diego now are all architect developers, either colleagues of mine that I went to school with and or studied under. So after learning from them, I decided to come back to my hometown to try to create this type of housing. So I'm grateful to be here to be able to speak to this. It's interesting. This is the example of a duplex unit I'm going to kind of go through as an architect developer who's created this type of housing. I don't know where other missing middle housing has been built in the city over the last 10 years. I'm sure there's small examples, but with such a large city, we should definitely have a lot more of these and make it a lot easier, more of on a by right kind of situation. So I'm kind of going to give you a little information here and leave a lot more time for questions. So the property, our Murphy's Law of Silicon Valley tech issues didn't allow me to zoom in on these images, so it's going to be a little hard to read. But so the property is a 50-foot by 125-foot lot, 6,225 square foot lot from what I remember. It's located just northeast, I guess, of the Alameda, off Newell. If you go to Bill's on the Alameda and take a right into that neighborhood, this property is there. You could barely see it. It's like right here in the green. Again, it's hard to see these images like this, but what was a single-family home, what was left was a shack of a garage. This is, again, an R2 zone lot, which is by right in the zoning, a duplex lot, zoned residential neighborhood under the general plan. So a pretty easy process from a city standpoint, from a planning entitlements on paper, I guess. Sorry, this didn't come out as great as, it's not as legible here today, but I just wanted to go over kind of the keys to success in developing small projects. The speed is the key, like I said. Quick to design, quick to build, and quick to sell and or rent. Mitigating your risk and investment, because everyone talks about from a development standpoint, and developers make a lot of profit. I don't know when Michael Van Avery's still there, but they also risk a ton of money and other people's money, and it's kind of a equation people don't think about, the amount of actual dollars put into these projects. I don't know what signature projects cost, but they're upwards in hundreds of millions of dollars. This project wasn't as expensive, but again, speed is key. Being the architect, it's easy to design a project like this. There's no client meetings, scheduling issues, feedback, changes in design, new meetings. As the architect and developer, we could make these decision points instantly as we're pen to paper or more likely mouse to computer screen. Again, the entitlement process, speed is key. Most projects require a preliminary review, also the site development permit in this case, and then permitting, construction documentation, same, there's design issues there from a drawing standpoint of creating the permitting documents, going through the building department, and other departments, public works. And I'm going to mention off-site improvements, because that's kind of a key issue with this project. And then there's the building process, relying on not just yourselves, but a team of people. Every project, even one that adds one unit to the overall amount of units in San Jose, like our project did, there's a lot of people involved in herding of cats. Inspections are key, and getting subcontractors to show up is all key. And then selling the project and/or renting out. Timing is also key here, and all of the things lined up before you actually sell dictates the timing. So I'm just kind of throwing this out there as a kind of education point on some of these projects. So the project I set out to create was what I like to call an urban farmhouse style. As a designer, this modern farmhouse is sort of a incrementally more aesthetic style than just the Sears catalog style of homes. As an architect, and I like a little more of a funky modern aesthetic from my colleagues in San Diego. I tried to blend the two, and then my design aesthetic for this project. What came out of the design was actually this project, and I'll just explain a little bit on what I call lean development, which is a result of sort of the missing middle housing type, but how you build these type of projects. And what it is you build less, therefore there's less cost, and you could actually create a product that could pencil and have less risk if sold for a less amount of money. So all areas that you're being built are sellable. Like a garage isn't necessarily sellable. It's, again, a place for a car. You do have to build a garage. It has 4 walls, a roof, and a floor or a foundation. And volume, like as an architect, I like light and air and space. And if you create 2-story heights, it makes a dynamic space, but you're not actually using a lot of square footage for those things. So it's hard to see this project if you can't zoom in on it. But we had a very small living space, a little office, and you go up, it's a 2-bedroom, 2.5 bath. On site, we had the center of the home, or the 2 homes, is actually a townhouse duplex. This kitchen, living, bathroom. So you really don't have shared walls between the 2 units that are private, like bedrooms. And we had these carports out here that would store the cars under a cover as required. However, if you don't need the cars, then it becomes a nice open space for the tenants. Again, this is our design. This is not what got built. This is what got built, and we can't really get into this in the other document. This is a PDF. I could open up and go through the plans, but through the planning process, the carports weren't supported. We needed to have a garage, so we had to change from these carports to the exterior and build in a tandem garage in the middle, and it kind of completely changed the aspect and the economics around our project. So again, we built the garage out. We had to build these very nice architecturally porches, but given the nature of how the lot is laid out, the porches probably won't get used enough, and they're just added cost again. And we kind of took away a little bit of the architecture from my creation standpoint and put in a little bit more traditional elements that fit more into the neighborhood context. But without a couple bold statements from architecture, you can't understand if neighborhoods would support bold architecture or not. And we get more into the kind of San Jose nature of very minimal architectural expression. Again, a couple of my notes here, just saying we modified some of the design, and it did actually add a lot of cost to our project. So I wanted to talk about a little bit delays in the permitting process. There was a couple of things that made it hard. The development, yeah, okay. So just from a process standpoint in this missing middle and what you're doing with Plex housing, the development portion of this project I actually did as a side hustle to my main job as an architect, where I was involved in basically doing 90% of the work on entitling a 182 unit project. This duplex took the same amount of time and actually had more feedback from planning department and neighbors than the 182 unit project. If there's any indication on speed to market, the other aspect of this type of projects I wanted to talk about as we kind of punch through these images here of the construction process and what was the result was that the financing mechanism and the labor pool to build these. Anyone that could build any kind of wood frame home could build this, and almost anyone that could qualify for a home loan could actually build these type of units as well. It's not just the large hedge funds or equity funds that are building these large development signature projects. Any mom and pop could pool some retirement and build housing for either themselves and their families or as an investment. And it just like what we've done with ADUs, those are also very small investment development projects. These missing middle Plex housing can be mom and pop developers creating these housing for our communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. Great local examples of great projects. David, do you want to take it away? Oh, well, are there any questions for our speakers? I think it was pretty self-explanatory. I thought they were great examples from, San Jose and places elsewhere. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to expand density, upzone. No, I'll use all the words we're banned from using. But thanks a lot, Dan. Those were really great and good reminders for us on how we need to talk about these projects.
Okay, and as I understand it, later in our process, we're going to have a further discussion and vote on implementing these kinds of concepts in some areas adjoining urban villages that are single-family development areas. Isn't that correct, staff?
Yes.
All right, yeah. So this was information in preparation for that future discussion we're going to have on one of those council referrals to us. So we're going to return now to the action items on urban villages, and I have a question for staff before we proceed. There's a motion on the floor, and Councilmember Davis also has an inquiry on an amendment to that motion, but I do have a question related to what the impact might be of some of the changes here. And as I understand in the staff packet on pages 4 and 5, there's the table here. It's the memo that's dated today, December 11th. When you look at it, it's a good summary of, what the significance of signature projects is, which is, as you'll see, those projects can move ahead without a plan, without an urban village plan. And the idea was they're above average. I don't want to get into semantics about excellent, signature, extraordinary, awesome, wonderful. We're going to move away from that and have some criteria, but the idea back then was there should be some process, some way to move projects forward if on their face they're really outstanding. So now we're talking about criteria, and Eric has referenced some changes to it. And the question I want to ask staff is, we have 60-something urban villages, correct?
Correct.
If we reduce the minimum standard of a size of a parcel to 1.5 acres, and only 100 feet of frontage, how many urban villages are at least an acre and a half in size and have at least that amount of frontage?
Well, I mean, they all are all bigger than 1.5 acres. They all have more frontage than that. Of course, they're made up by multiple properties, but and they all are larger than that.
Okay. And so if those projects, since they all meet that minimum size and they met the other criteria, all of those urban villages could go ahead without an urban village plan.
The signature projects could, correct.
Right. Yeah, and they'd have to meet the other criteria that were on the table. And I understand that. But so I'm thinking, you know, that raises broader questions that, you know, I think deserve some maybe further input. It raises broader questions about what level of public participation do we want to have for urban villages. This is the main method of growth we're seeing for the city in residential. We'll get to you, Eric. This is the main means of growth in the city, and if every project meets those bare minimum requirements of 1.5 acres and 100 feet of footage, plus the other criteria, I understand that, then a significant number of urban villages could go forward without the urban village plan. Some people might view that's a positive. The process is too slow. It's an impediment to development. Other people might feel that doesn't provide enough opportunity for public input. So I'm a little bit concerned about proceeding on just quickly changing the criteria without having some more in-depth information from staff on that, to what extent. And so what I'd like to suggest is that we get that information before changing the criteria that low.
There's a motion and second on the floor.
Yeah, I know you're urgent about it, and we'll go through this, but we're a 40-member task force here, and maybe I'm the only person who feels that way, and that's fine, but I do think that something that might have consequences of that nature, which the development community could favor, and could be very positive for housing development, might be counterproductive to public input. I just want to know, if we change the criteria to this extent, how many projects, how many of the 60-something urban villages might possibly be able to go forward without this planning? And, okay. Eric, you seem quite eager.
Well, because the process is not being correctly described. What you keep saying is that if a criteria is met, that the urban village goes forward. That's not the case. An individual project gets to go forward, a single project. That does not open up a whole village to development.
And it would be part of
A single
piece-
project.
Right, a piece of that urban village could move forward without a plan.
A single project.
Right.
Yeah.
Within the urban
With
village.
required community meetings, just like any development in the city. So this city has, you know, community outreach galore on every development, so there's no risk of that. So getting back to Councilmember Davis's question, she asked the potential of a friendly amendment. If I understood the question, it was, should we require that the existing commercial space on a site be replaced, and in addition add the required amount of jobs? Is that correct?
No, so it would be an or. So if the average jobs density for the urban village is lower than what's existing on that site, then you would choose the criteria instead that they have to maintain what's on that site.
Yeah, so I think I'm saying.
Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. I think I said it differently.
Okay.
But the general plan already requires that if there is existing commercial space on the site, that the project must replace that commercial space and in addition, add the planned average job density for the urban village.
Okay, so the existing commercial square footage is the floor.
That's the floor.
Okay,
And in addition,
great.
you have to add on the additional average jobs. So if
Okay.
I have a site that has a 20,000 square foot commercial building, and the urban village requires, let's just make up a number, 10,000 additional feet for the site, then I have to do a project that has 30,000 square feet for that site. And that's codified in the general plan, and that's how the staff has implemented it.
Correct. So my suggestion is we come back next time. We will bring, I think for a lot of you, this is all like, whoosh, whoosh, it's, you don't understand, this is very wonky. A few of us in the room understand it really well. And I think it would be really helpful is if we come back and give you some real examples of a signature project that is under construction or we've approved recently, and you can actually look at it and really understand what a signature project looks like and what some of the rules that we have, how they are applied and what that looks like. So that would be my recommendation.
Who's next, Shiloh?
So a couple things, I think. One is I would like to go back to amplifying what Councilmember Arenas mentioned, as well as Asen, around community outreach. And I know that, Jennifer, you addressed this, and I'm not sure I completely understood what the process is, but if we do decide to, if this motion fails and we do decide to come back and discuss this further, I would love to hear more about how we could beef up the community outreach piece of the signature project stuff. And then I also wanted to say that, so in the last presentation, Teresa, you had said, does anyone have any questions? And I went like this, and then.
I'm sorry. Sorry about
So I just want to state for the record, the question that I would have, or the issue that I would like to flag with the folks that were here, is the equity piece, and whether when we bring this back and discuss it further, we can be looking at these concepts through an equity lens. And, for example, what does it mean for existing residents who are on a property in terms of displacement? What does it mean in terms of, potentially advantaging folks who own property to make more money on their property, potentially at the expense of people who live there? Just those playing out some of the chess pieces in terms of what the real world implications are of this concept of gentle density, which I like on the face of it, but I'm just concerned about if we're not thinking through what the real world implications are on poor people in particular.
Thank you, Shiloh. I think, Juan, are you next?
Yeah, I'm here. So I appreciate that staff noted the need for more due diligence, and I can totally understand that. And I want to point out that earlier when I used the word test, we're testing for the next 4 years, I would encourage us not to be afraid to test something new that might achieve better results, right? More housing, because in the end, I don't think that we want urban villages where no new development is occurring, right? It's not going to help. And so I say that, I suggest that when staff go back and get information so that we can have more due diligence, that potential alternatives be proposed that might incorporate all of the feedback. I'm sorry, don't know how to say your name. Asen and Shiloh? That we attempt to incorporate that if possible, or that staff attempt to incorporate it if possible, because maybe there is something that is worthy of testing that might meet a lot of the needs, including those of developers, so that housing happens. Okay.
Thank you.
Who's next on the left side here? Anyone? Margie?
sorry.
Or-
Roberta.
Thank you. So I do want to emphasize 4 would not pass. 4 urban villages would not pass with existing criteria. Signature, thank you, sorry. And then I did some math, because I'm a math person. And I have a house on North 5th Street, about 2 blocks from here. So taking the frontage of 45 feet, the frontage, and then taking the square footage of that lot, in order for them to proceed with a signature project with Eric's proposal of 1.5 acres and 100 feet of frontage, he'd have to buy 11 lots, and he'd have to buy 3 as frontage lots. So I don't know, I just think it's good to look at kind of what that means in the areas where these probably will happen. So I wanted people to have an image of that, 3 lots right downtown and about 4 deep, right? 3 wide, 4 deep. So that's it.
Thank you. Okay, Eddie?
Thank you. Just want to go back to some comments that Councilmember Davis made. I think we have a really big opportunity to streamline housing development on sites with existing commercial uses and essentially build housing near jobs. For those sites where there are existing commercial uses and you're adding housing on top of that, it shouldn't be an impediment to that particular conversion, and they should be considered signature projects. Such signature projects should not be required to meet the average jobs density calculation so long as the existing commercial uses are preserved. And I really want to make that comment and really emphasize that because that's an opportunity, as I mentioned before, to build housing near jobs.
Can you repeat that last part?
Yeah, so for sites with existing commercial uses, and if you wanted to build, especially for those that have 0 existing commercial uses, but they don't have any residential units right now, if one were to allow more flexibility in the signature project process and to amend that and to recognize that there should be credit for those sites that are building more housing near jobs, there should be some acknowledgement of that balancing out factor in the signature project process.
And what would that look like?
I would suggest that if the site preserves existing commercial uses, then it shouldn't be required to meet the additional average jobs density calculation as proposed by the staff recommendation.
You know, this is an area that might help with clarification from the staff, though, because you're using the term urban villages and you're also using the term signature projects in your comments, and they're both different, and Eric's pointed that out as well. The question to staff is, urban villages, a plan that can move forward, there isn't any minimum requirement for commercial development, is that correct?
No, that's not correct. So depending on the land use designation in an approved urban village, there
Right.
will be minimum FARs of commercial that are required.
Well,
But
let
that
me-
is done as part of the comprehensive planning effort that's done with the community, deciding where they want to see mixed-use projects and where they want to see a minimum commercial on that site before residential can be built.
So correct. So there's no criteria in the general plan that establishes what projects have to do in an urban village. It isn't in the general plan. What is in the general plan is to prepare a plan with the community that outlines a plan of how you're going to achieve the housing and job objectives in an urban village plan.
All right.
But that's a separate process that comes when you initiate an urban village plan.
What's FAR?
Floor area ratio.
Okay, so, all right. Let's start on the right side here. Councilmember?
Thank you, Chair. So I wanted to include in, and I don't know if I already did, I just kind of preliminary said, please include this in your motion, so I wanted to check in with Eric. I wanted to ensure that there's a path forward for the public outreach, and I know that there's already some work being done, and I forgot, Jennifer, what did you say? It was policy 6-30, right? So it's already on the list. I think this is a greater conversation than just for signature projects, but of course inclusive of. So I wanted to see if we could have staff come back and give us some outreach, maybe options to look at. Either we could defer this piece on the outreach, depending on how everybody feels. Like, I've heard a couple of comments, and I think there is an appetite to talk about this a little bit more. So I'm hoping, Eric, that we can have a friendly amendment to defer the outreach piece and have staff come back and give us some options.
I don't think you had outreach as part of your motion, right?
No, I'm asking him to add that as a friendly amendment.
Well, the motion includes adopting all of staff recommended criteria with the amendments to the site selection requirement and the job density. So
Got it.
we can either defer the public meeting requirement and come back to that, or we can leave it in and direct staff to come back with specificity on the style of community engagement. Because that appears to be the issue. It's not necessarily the number of meetings, but how it's
Right.
conducted.
Right.
I'm happy
Right, it's the
to.
quality of
Yeah, I'm
the
happy
outreach.
to incorporate that into the motion so that the direction of staff is to come back with specifics on what style of engagement.
And is there a who was the seconder? Michael, what do you, your thoughts?
I'm in
Thank you. You're fine. Okay, let's get through these final round of comments. It's 8:30. So Jesse?
Real quick, on this slide here, we're showing that the policy incentivizes density, specifically density above 55 units per acre, and I think that's great. We should be doing that because that's fiscally positive on, that was noted in Eric's letter. Secondly, we're incentivizing sites that generate additional open space. One of the things that's missing from this, though, is we're not incentivizing signature projects that are including affordable housing in percentages greater than the local inclusionary housing ordinance. And I'd like to see an amendment where if a signature review project is proposing on-site affordable housing in excess of the local IHO policy or San Jose's IHO policy, that there would be consideration for additional reduction in the number of jobs required on site.
Thank you. Michelle?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Actually, moving forward with this, Eric will be surprised to hear I was ready to agree with him. But something kind of has been clarified, partly from David mentioning that this is not the urban village we're talking about. It's one project in an urban village. And it wants to jump the queue, skip all of this messy neighborhood input stuff, and move ahead. And it seems in exchange for that, the community and the city thought they should get a reward for allowing the project to bypass all that procedural stuff. Not a bad idea, and it's a trade-off. But if there is no particularly great benefit to the community, the project shouldn't be allowed to go forward. The city of San Jose, from the time this general plan hit the streets, has had a jobs housing problem. It's had a jobs housing problem for years, and at least when I went before the council for confirmation, the council members hammered on me really hard. Jobs are important. We have to keep that in mind in order to stay afloat, basically. So I still think that's important. And now that I've been listening to some of the other input and remembering what staff said when they identified each of these incentives that was to be offered, they said, you know, this is less than what we're getting, this is just barely what we're getting, these all appear to be pretty feasible. In other words, they weren't excessively large. It's not like they're asking for a great big fancy expensive huge improvement package in order for these signature projects to go forward. They were reasonable. And now we're starting to pick at the edges. I like the idea of more affordable housing, not less affordable housing, because we're trying to squeeze housing in every place we can right now. And yes, that would be a suitable incentive. But I am worried that we end up getting fewer jobs in exchange for allowing a project to jump the queue, in effect. And so I talked myself out of agreeing with you, Eric, sorry.
Your assessment isn't accurate.
Yeah,
We're not
and
getting less
Councilmember
jobs.
Foley wants to talk about
We're
that
not
as
getting
well.
less
And then we're
jobs.
going to zoom down this row.
I really sense some confusion over these public meetings. The proposal from staff requires 2 public meetings. That isn't changing. That's the requirement, and in most areas, I have a signature project that's being proposed in District 9 right now. Jennifer's been very involved in it. We've had more than 2 community meetings, and we will continue to have community meetings because that's what we do in San Jose, as Eric said. We engage our community as much as possible. So this doesn't say no community meetings. This says that we're going to have 2 community meetings. It also states, based on the motion and the friendly amendment, that the jobs that are currently available on site stay there or greater as they go up, not decrease. So the motion on the floor and the amendments on the floor, I'm going to support, and I suggest we all vote for it.
Okay, Leslie?
Just really quickly, I know we're going to spend a lot more time on housing coming up, but I do think we need to talk a little bit more about that jobs housing issue. And we have a severe housing problem. We have not built anywhere near what is expected in the general plan or what's in the mayor's plan. We've got to figure out what kind of barriers we've put in the way to housing development. The fact only 12 of these urban villages have plans means that, 50 some odd don't? And so that's why this issue of signature projects is so important, because right now we have essentially growth controlled out a significant number of parcels that could be available for both housing and job growth. And we have to recognize that in some of the urban villages, jobs just don't make sense. And I think the fact that we've only seen 8 signature projects that have been proposed in how many years? 10 years? How many years is it?
8 years.
That tells us there's a problem with the signature projects. And so, I appreciate staff looking at coming up with these objective standards, but we need to make sure what standards we put in place actually make these signature projects possible. And I would differ with a few speakers who have stated that that's a problem and we shouldn't want to see these project here and there go forward. We need to see those projects going forward. We have people who are priced out, who we want to be able to stay here, who we need to for our workers, for those jobs that we're creating. And so I think we have to make sure whatever it is we approve, that it's workable.
Thank you. Carl?
So I support the motion that we're speaking to, but I wanted to address the job housing issue.
Okay.
Definitely, housing is our biggest problem right now, and affordability because of lack of supply. But from the job housing, this policy, the land use policy, is talking about capacity. I'm not convinced that this capacity policy is actually hurting our ability to improve that ratio. I think there's other factors involved. Having this go through in our existing policy as it relates to jobs housing, I think allows for the capacity already. So if we make it a higher ratio for jobs, I'm not sure that's solving the problem.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, so I think when you look at San Jose's building permit production over the last 30 years, we've averaged about 3,000 building permits a year, and we can do better. The general plan identified priority development areas in this city for downtown and urban villages, and yet we want to keep measures in place that restrict housing production in areas that we've identified where we should grow. When you look at the state's recent law changes with objective and subjective standards, I think it's really important that when you set a bar for a signature project, that bar is achievable. And when you look at parcel sizes within the city and you look at urban forms of development, I mean, I can tell you as a developer who builds 20-story towers in downtown San Jose that a 1.5 acre site or a 3 acre site is enormous. I can fit a lot of units on a 1.5 to 3 acre site. And so I think you need to be, and so I'm going to support Eric and Michael's motions, but I'd be surprised to learn if there are very very few 1.5 acre sites within urban villages in the city that we can actually develop on and implement this policy.
Thank you so much. Harvey, and then I think it's David?
Thank you. A couple of comments. One to the amount of land within the urban villages. We reduce the amount of land that is required in the frontages for the signature projects. What do we do to these projects, these urban villages that will be planned in the future, and we stick something in the middle of it or on the edge of it or whatever? What kinds of constraints are we producing for the future development of that urban village? I'd like some numbers, Michael. I'd like some numbers to, if we don't pass it tonight, if we delay the vote, to see what kinds of changes this would engender.
Thank you.
The second thing is, remember, we keep talking about housing, and I understand we have a huge issue with housing in the county, but we still are, when I started this process in 2007 or 8, whenever it was, we had 0.82 jobs per employed resident. We still have 0.2 jobs per employed resident. We are building housing for Cupertino, Mountain View, Santa Clara, and beyond. And we're not except with the exception of the Google project and Adobe and a few other places within the city, we really aren't providing many more housing.
Thank you, Harvey.
I mean, more jobs.
Okay. I think we have, I mean, we're getting, Eric, I don't think we need to have further response and clarification. I think we're getting pretty good clarity and unanimity. I want to get us to a vote soon and get some public comment. So Michael, you have the last word?
It's me and then Michael.
Oh,
Yeah, if we're going down the line. So I just had a parliamentary procedure question. So we have a motion and a second, and we had 2 potential friendly amendments, one of which was accepted, the other of which I was maybe not, because David had asked to defer it. So I would like to know, before we finish, can you just reiterate what exactly we're
So
voting on?
Where I believe we're at is the jobs density approving all the staff's recommendations, except for the job density and changing that to a fair share, meeting the average plan density for an urban village, right? This is the signature project. And then there was good recommendations around coming back and having a conversation about what is the quality of community engagement, not just the number of meetings, but really more understanding of what that really means, who we're engaging and how. There was also the recommendation of changing the site selection to 1.5 acres with a frontage of 100 feet. I don't know of a fourth, unless I'm totally missing it.
I have a
Yeah.
fourth. Dev's was keep the commercial space on site,
Yes.
whichever is greater.
But then you had said to defer, when she had said that, and he was going to accept
It's
it or not,
already in
you
the
had
general,
asked to defer.
it's already in the general plan.
That's already in, so that's not a part of this
Okay, thanks.
motion. Okay, Michael.
And number 5, here we go.
Oh, no, it's 4. It would be
I
4.
want to also is one that Ms. O'Malley brought up about if a project exceeds the local ordinance for affordable housing, that it would reduce the job requirement. And I would direct staff as part of that to come back with the incentives for that. So I'd ask for that friendly amendment to also be included. Again, as an example, I have a transit station, and we're going to exceed the local ordinance, yet we're still having to provide additional. So I'd like to ask for a friendly amendment for that to be included.
I think we still need clarity in what you're saying. I'm seeing a lot of
I'll defer to Ms.
question
O'Malley.
marks. You'll defer, I'm sorry?
I'm deferring to Ms. O'Malley's amendment.
Okay. Jesse, can you clarify your amendment?
I was making the comment that we are incentivizing both density and additional open space, but we have a housing crisis today. And so if we don't start incentivizing affordable housing on site to be built in excess of our inclusionary housing ordinance, we're not focused on the right thing. And so my friendly amendment is that we would incentivize signature review projects if they have affordable housing in excess of the inclusionary housing ordinance, that they would have a reduction in the number of jobs that they have to supply on site. I don't have a specific method on what that reduction is. I think we need some help from staff on that, but I think it should be incentivized on site.
Okay, can I respond to that?
We have
Please.
10 minutes for the meeting. Yes, you can respond, Eric.
So
if
what
you'd
I would
like, as the
recommend is,
motioner.
since we're trying to come up with prescriptive criteria, and we don't have a specific proposal on how do you calculate how much change in jobs for affordable housing, I think that we should refer this
Yeah.
item to staff along with the community engagement quality, and have those two items come back for separate consideration at a future meeting once we have a specific
That makes sense.
proposal.
Michael, do you
That'll be in the motion.
concur?
Agreed.
Okay,
Okay.
so then the substance of the motion would be your first two comments around job density and site selection, for now. With a referral to staff for community engagement and the, any incentives for.
That's-
Could I ask for a point of clarification?
Wait, does that accurately summarize what you said, Eric?
Yeah, so we're going to approve all of staff's recommendations with the two changes.
Yep.
One is that the site selection would be 1.5 acres.
Yep.
And a minimum of 100 feet frontage. And the job requirement is to meet
Yes.
the average
That's what I said.
job requirement for that urban
That's what I said.
village.
Yes,
Which, by the way, is the number created by
Okay.
staff to achieve 1.1 jobs per employed resident.
That's an
So
important-
this notion, I want to convince Commissioner Yesney to agree with me. The notion that we are reducing the jobs goal or the jobs
Right.
requirement of our general plan is
Good.
not accurate. We are going to meet the average planned for, which means achieving the 1.1 jobs per employed
Great.
resident that's in the
great
general plan.
clarification. Thank you so much. Do you still have a clarifying
I
question?
still have
And we
you
need,
convinced me on that point. My question had to do with the council member's response that to the two public meetings. I understood that for a signature project, you only have to do two public meetings. And I know we're going to work on the quality and all of that. And for an urban village plan to be approved, there are many, many more than two public meetings, are there not?
Some of my urban villages had 3 public meetings,
But
just 3.
But in addition, what we hear in testimony from the communities when the urban villages come to the commission for approval is people get up and talk about how they attended meeting after meeting after meeting in the development of the village plan itself, because it was a very public intensive process.
right.
So that process is what we're skipping.
And we can talk about that at the next, we're referring that
Yes.
piece of this motion. We have 3 more comments, and then we're going to take a vote. Okay, Pat?
I just want to say I support Eric's motion. When we talk about the housing situation today, all you have to do is look at the numbers. We're not producing the housing. And anything we can do to incentivize housing, affordable as well as market rate, is what we need to be doing as a task force.
Thank you. Ethan?
I'm going to be cognizant of time, so I'm just not going to ask staff. I'm just going to ask Eric for a friendly amendment for staff to come back with a sense of what the impact of changing the site selection standards would look like and how many sites would become eligible for signature projects in the future, if that is a recommendation that the panel sends over to the full council.
What's the question?
I don't understand,
Well, I think we need to vote on this criteria, but
Yeah.
if for information purposes, we would like to know what number of sites
Agreed.
this would create, I'm fine with that.
Great.
But I do not want to defer the item or the vote.
Perfect. Okay, Juan? I mean, not Juan, Melanie?
So my comment was also, I guess, not delaying the vote. I think that perfect is sometimes the enemy of good. And particularly
Can
on
you put the mic closer, Melanie?
Sorry,
Thank
on
you.
the community outreach and the displacement concerns, these are obviously valid concerns, but we do have broader policies that can adjust, that can address some of these issues, like, for example, the council policy 630, and similarly on the displacement, this is a broader conversation that I think we need to decide what we want to do as a city. Putting displacement or equity criteria on the signature projects just creates additional rules and things that may be a barrier to development, but we need to have that conversation. I'm not sure the time is now to put an additional requirement on the signature policy.
Okay, I'm going to support the motion with the additions that have been added. I think the suggestions about revisiting public engagement is a good way of seeking a balance here, of allowing good projects to move forward while having sufficient public involvement. I'm also persuaded by Councilmember Foley's comments too that each of the council members are very concerned about projects in their districts and will ensure a good level of public participation. We do know that the urban village plans take a while. They take about 18 months. And that's the reason that we supported in the original plan the signature project idea. I was one of the supporters of that, and I think it's important to strike a balance here. So I think the discussion's been good, and we'll get some more information back on the other issues. So all in favor of the motion? Any opposed? Good job, Eric.
And we have several items that have been referred to staff for discussion next time, including, Juan, your comments about new urban villages, and of course, I'm not going to reiterate all of them. We obviously did not get to item 7 on the agenda, and we will take that up at the next meeting as well. I do want to invite anyone who came in late and wants to make public comment to please do so now. We had public comment also at the beginning of the meeting, but I would welcome anyone else who would like to make additional comment to come up to the mic now. Thank you.
I'm interested in that missing middle. How does that
Can you
fit?
speak up, Larry? Thank you.
Is this thing turned on?
There you go, yes.
How does this
And
missing
introduce
middle?
yourself, please.
Larry Ames, hi there. How does this missing middle fit in this policy here? It doesn't fit with the urban villages because you want to have higher density there, and you don't want to destroy the existing neighborhoods, especially the historic districts. You don't want to lose the character of the city. So where does this, I mean, I could see it maybe as a transition between the urban villages and the existing areas, but that was not spelled out. So I'd like to know. Thank you.
We did mention that it is informational item 4, really that a topic that will come up at the next meeting in January.
I see.
Thank you. Next. Yes, Ray.
Are we also deferring the discussion on horizons as well?
Wow, good point. Yeah. We ran out of time. Can we finish this, do you mind? And then we'll come back to that? We can always stay late if we want. Yes, sir, sorry.
Hello, my name's Tom. I'm a resident of District 8, Tom Paramo. A short statement, a little under 2 minutes. We understand the purpose of the San Jose's Envision 2040 plan to provide a planning compass for San Jose to maintain a high quality of life for both resident and business. We also hope this task force takes to heart the impact your revisions will have on us in the years to come. Urban villages are the contemporary design in which cities like San Jose must adopt in order to deal with limited living space, extended communities, pedestrian safety, and quality of life. Our concern is that a project that includes a large underground parking garage is currently in the city's planning pipeline, and it is slated for a well-established residential R15 zoned neighborhood in Evergreen. You would be hard-pressed to Google and find another example of such a large-scale construction project that would entail, just in the first 3.5 years of construction, the excavating and removal of over 600,000 tons of earth. A project of this magnitude is currently making its way through the planning department. The project would be built on a 1.9-acre cornered lot adjacent to a problematic four-way stop on Ruby and Norwood Avenues. The compound on the surface would have the following: a 2,300 square foot kitchen, 2,700 square feet of living quarters, 4,300 square foot temple, 5,000 square foot community room, and a 43,000 square foot of underground parking for 90 cars. The idea of building such a large project with an underground complex in a well-established residential neighborhood seems ludicrous. This is a non-conforming structure that is only suitable being built in an urban village area close to public transportation. Revising the 2040 plan to allow a project of this proportion and magnitude to be built as is without making fundamental changes to its scope and scale would set a precedent in which the city may find they have opened a Pandora box of unintended consequences.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
I'm Tessa Woodman C. from District 6. I think that this whole discussion of jobs as a priority harkens back to Donald Trump in terms of, oh, he's increased our jobs, but they've all been fossil fuel-based jobs. And this whole thing of saying that we need more jobs when we know we have a housing crisis is really, despicable. And we need to be focusing on quality of life, and also in regards to not gross domestic product, but gross domestic happiness, and how we need to focus on just basic living qualities of housing and basic needs as we go into a climate emergency. And we can't be thinking about economics and politics and religion. We must think about biology, physics, and engineering. And we need to engineer our neighborhoods to be resilient. And I thought that the middle the middle housing was just a beautiful concept of density and reducing our amount of resources we're using, because we've already, in 1950, we went over Earth's capacity. We've already, we're using more of Earth's capacity since 1950. And we have to reduce our impact on the Earth. And that middle village of creating that type of beautiful housing was very inspirational. And I really encourage us to build that way. And also, we need more public input in terms of our the way our development is going, because we did not get that in our neighborhood. Our city council member never even came to our development of our hotel that's being planned in our we had one meeting, and then we had like 15 minutes of public comment. They cut it off very quickly. So that was really bad, the way public comment went, and the way and we had 65 people coming to resist the hotel in our neighborhood. And we need housing, and we also need fossil fuel-free jobs. And the way our housing needs to be developed is with regenerative organic agriculture and building food security and food sustainability into our housing.
No, I know. Yes, thank you. We're tracking time. Thank you.
This is Alex again with Catalyze SV. Wanted to take a moment and just talk about Policy 6-30, which came up a little bit tonight. First, thank you to Councilmember Arenas and the other members of the task force who talked about community engagement and the need for quality. Commissioner Griswold brought up Policy 6-30. She and many of you in this room know that city council, city staff, including planning, have a lot of priorities and a lot of things they're working on a given basis. When the city auditor's report about this Policy 6-30 came to the city council earlier this year, city staff said, because of all the other competing priorities we have, it will take us 30 months to fully implement the city auditor's recommendations. So whereas it's outstanding that will happen, hopefully sooner than that, we also want to address these issues through the signature policy process because they're on somewhat different tracks. And so we think it's really valuable for you all to be having that discussion as well. And definitely Catalyze SV has weighed in on the city auditor's report and some additional ideas on how to do great community engagement. Because I think ultimately what we all want in this room is the ideas of community members to show up in the projects that are built to make public support grow for housing and better development. And that's all that we're trying to do at our organization, and that's all that we appreciate you all taking a look at, and thank you to staff leading into the January 30th task force meeting for looking into this. We stand ready to keep talking with you all about it. Thank you.
Robert Reese from Evergreen. I believe that in the staff report, the description of the Ellis Act may have been incorrectly stated. It says that 50% of the units would be under rent control. I think it has been changed to 50% of the units or 7 times the existing units, whichever is smaller. You may make a note of that. On the issue with the horizons, I think that when the council made the 17,000 units available, when they reviewed the annual general plan review and they looked at the housing crisis plan, they did it in a significant way. Those 17,000 units were selected based upon the criteria that they had rail access and were on the bus rapid transit line. So I think as you look at the horizons, you may want to, in collapsing them and having more units become available quicker, it's not an all or nothing proposition, but if you were to have more units in addition to the 17,000 units become available, you would want to establish it based on some criteria that looks at transportation, because there's a multifaceted nature of goals that we have in the plan, and it's important that we look at everything when we look at it. For example, I'm wondering if there was another 10,000 units added to what the council did with the 17,000 units and the 8,000 units on North San Jose, what would the criteria be for those 10,000 units? Because it's important to think it through, because we're doing many things with this plan at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fred Buzo with AARP California here in San Jose, and I just wanted to acknowledge the work that staff has done on all these issues, really, and also thank staff for acknowledging the work that we have done in regards to neighborhood business districts, and specifically North 13th Street. I know that we will be talking about that at the next meeting, but given that Dan Parolic will not be present at the next meeting, I just want, until we get to that next meeting, please keep what he said in mind. That it's not simply about building housing in a silo or in a vacuum. It's about building neighborhoods. And that was one of the focuses that we had at our Livable Community charrette, was how do we build great neighborhoods for people of all ages? And so part of that is about missing middle housing. We don't call it missing middle housing because, as Dan said, it gets a little confusing. It's real small-scale residential development. How do we integrate that into existing neighborhood business districts? And also in this next month, while we wait for this next meeting to come about, go out and check out these neighborhood business districts. I mean, really look at them. They're very different, each one of them. And actually what you'll see in some of them is that housing is already there and it exists. So this notion that we are going to just build a bunch of housing and put it into these neighborhood business districts is not entirely true, because it's already there. And so think about what that means for the folks who already live there, and what creating better neighborhoods and greater neighborhoods means for the folks who are already there and in the surrounding areas. But looking forward to next month. Thanks.
Thank you. I really want to thank all the task force members. I thought there was a really productive meeting, really good conversation. These are not easy topics, especially for people for whom this is their first general plan task force engagement. So thank you all for being very engaged, very attentive, very respectful of one another. And all these issues are interrelated. So I know they are complex in that way. We will defer, unless I hear otherwise, the question about horizons to the next meeting. The next meeting has a lot of meaty topics on it, and that list, that agenda is growing. So we will be working with staff over the next month to really craft what that looks like and ensure we have enough conversation, enough information to make good decisions. The good thing is David's leading the next conversation of the next meeting, because we're alternating, so that's helpful. Michael, did you want to say something?
Yes, for the next meeting, we recommend you bring pajamas.
Teresa, can I just, it's really nice to have presentations. However, we have a lot of substance to go through, and the fact that we couldn't get through it because we had a very long presentation while it was interesting might not be that useful. So I don't know how everyone else feels, but I would rather spend our time having discussion rather than having presentations.
I think one, you know, I think we need to be mindful of the time, but we just also have to remember that not everyone on this committee is really steeped in these issues on a daily basis. So I think a balance is really valuable, but thank you. Okay, any other final comments? If not, happy holidays, everyone. Happy holidays.